This is Robert L. Green doing an interview with John Kobal and doing this for the archives at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. Now, those of us who are longtime fans of John's work recognize his extraordinary interest in everything about the making of movies. And I guess in some ways, as an archivist, he probably has affected and influenced those of us who are amateurs in the field and who are buffs in the sense that we adore movies. I once wrote a piece many years ago called Movies, My Secret Finishing School, and it was true. It was that I learned most of the mores and manas that I identified with as opposed to the ones that I were exposed to from films. And whatever position of good taste, judgment that I have achieved in my life came out of that extraordinary force of the artificial world of film, which of course created its own kind of superiority. But much of my own interest has been supported and information has been added to my life through Kobal's books. So I was delighted to have the opportunity of meeting him and asking him to do this tape. John, how did you get started in all this?
This shouldn't be difficult to answer, should it? Though it's taking me a long time because I've been asked that a lot. How did you get started? I don't know what the point of getting started is. The first time I had a photograph, the first time I realized that one-on-one photographs would make two, and if I had a lot of them, people would say, "Where'd you get those?" And they'd be impressed because they were of somebody they hadn't seen a picture of for a long time. And what a nice way of getting people to be interested in me. So knowing where I found those, I'd get more. That was one way, and I would think that was around. Well, nobody was interested in collecting the way I was interested in collecting when I was in Canada. I mean, all kids collect. I used to collect baseball cards, the kind you flip, bubble gum, and you flipped. And if you flipped, somebody else would throw down their 5 cards, and you had to match theirs. I won almost the only thing I've ever known that I used to always. The average of winning was 87%. If you had 12 cards, you flipped them. I would match your 12. Rarely would I lose. I mean, I was in torture, but obviously I was a keen collector, and whatever it was. In those days it was baseball cards, Then it was also cards of cars, which is why, in a strange way, without being interested in either baseball, yes, but football, hockey, cars, ships, old ships, whatever, I actually got to know a lot about it because I never had anything that I didn't want to know about. Otherwise, what was it? So I would read. I was an avid reader. I never had anything that I didn't have more of. So I was always a collector. I didn't know it, but I just was somebody who could never have enough. I don't know why, but the upshot was that I had, when I was, for instance, 11 years old, I had the biggest pile of comics in my neighborhood. And considering that my neighborhood was a part of Ottawa, the capital of Canada, and not something as exciting and flashy as New York or more metropolitan, and more with things available, I would have thought of, I was unique for just the fact that I collected so avidly, never mind what I had so much of. So I was always collecting, and I collected fan magazines, because if I wasn't reading a book, I was in the cinema. But as a business, as something that would become a business, as something more serious, as something where I would suddenly say, this is good and this isn't, I would think my collection starts in '64. I was in America. It was the first time I'd ever been to America. I went from Canada straight to England, and I came over here. And I wanted to meet movie stars. I had to justify the fact, because in London I had said to somebody, because I knew so much about movies, what is to say is I knew a lot about things people weren't interested enough to know more about than I did. And so therefore I was a novelty. Everybody else, that's really the way it is. And I would say to somebody, "Oh, but this film, don't you know about Barbara Stanwyck?" And then I would cite 7 of her movies. And if you do that, you're authoritative. Suddenly you seem to know something. They must be wrong. And so you gain a little bit of weight. And you also get free food that way. And I said to somebody I knew, a producer of the BBC, "I'm going to go to New York. And while I'm there, I'm going to be seeing a lot of movie stars. And would you like me to do some things for you, for his program?" He didn't know that the whole thing, my going and everything, would depend on him saying yes. for the £15 for a program that I got, which was then $27.50, and they wouldn't have more than one a week. Based on that $27.50 and the telegram he sent to New York, I went to New York. And I walked with that $27.50 guarantee at the offices of the BBC in New York. You know, I was the person dealing with the arts. Actually, it was just a program of movies, like what movies have you seen this week and that kind of stuff. But nobody else was doing it. You know, there was Charles Wheeler, United Nations, and something like Nampom or whatever his name was, whoever was the vice president or the secretary of the United Nations then, was saying this and that, and so forth had appeared, and always weighty. And when free tickets would arrive sometimes at the BBC, well, then Charles Wheeler had first crunch of them. There was Alistair Cook, his Voice from America, Letter from America was going on. I was introduced to that man about 20 times, and 20 times he looked at me as if the wallpaper was wrong. I mean, just never changed. I never knew if I thought that was very elegant and cool, or if I just thought he was a snob, but I thought, I will too become like you, know how to button my tie. I never have. I mean, I did think it was elegant, but I mean, he looked straight. Maybe he realized that I was just a phony, but nobody else did, you see. And so I called up the theater managers. I called up the press agents. I called up the movie companies. I called up the Metropolitan Opera. Suddenly tickets were coming in all the time. It was all on $27.50 a week. It was heaven. And so I actually had a reason for interviewing people. So now I had to go and do it. I wanted to, but I had to go and do it. And I would call somebody up. Oh, I know, there was a movie like Sylvia. Sylvia was playing. Carol Baker, Vivica Lynn, Anne Southern, Joanne Drew. Whatever happened to Joanne Drew? I said in 1964. Now in 1987 you say, whatever happened to it? My God. But Joanne Drew was in it again, and all these people. So I got somebody at Paramount to arrange some interviews, and they did it for my $27.50, because it would appear in London on a program that God knows who listened to, you know? And when I went to see Vivica Lindfors, I said, do you have any old photographs? Because I don't remember everything. I knew more than anybody else did, but that really wasn't much. But then everybody else knew nothing. You know, they just knew the film you just made. So they looked in the drawers, and of course she'd done films at Paramount. Remember this, in 64 you didn't have encyclopedias. You couldn't just go to book, open it up, and check Vivica Lindfors, born in Svölna, Sweden, blah, 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 all the film titles. You couldn't. You couldn't look it up in Anne Southern. You might call 3 friends who would give you titles that they remembered, and I didn't know other people. And so, I mean, I was a very knowledgeable person in a time when a little knowledge seemed to be an awful lot. So they let me look at the files. Well, we don't have any old stuff, John, but take a look. Because I was the BBC. And the big thrill was when Toodle Banker would say, oh, darling, you British have no money. I thought, oh, darling, how wonderful, she thinks I'm British. And she gave me money, and I took it. Because I wasn't British, and because, I mean, it was just people don't hear you, really.
What sort of money did she give you?
Well, I made her do a lot of interviews, and then they'd pay her more than they would pay me, and she'd give me those checks. And she also fed me the whole time. She fed me, you know, because she didn't need anyway. She didn't need, but it was typical of that kind of. But I started collecting. So that if I go to see Vivica Lindfors, I'd bring out some pictures, and she'd say, oh, where'd you find this? Don Juan. Oh, those costumes. Those costumes were the most beautiful thing about the movie. But the film, what do you mean, Vivica? That was the best film you ever made. You mean you didn't like it? Well, I was still new from Sweden. I wanted to do serious things, Vivica. Don't you realize that this is really serious? This is what was important? I mean, but you should have read the real script. What does it matter? I'm telling you about the script I saw, and I said, I saw you up there as the queen, and I thought you were just so wonderful, and I've admired you ever since. So how can you tell me it wasn't any good? This used to be my interviewing gambit, but it was also the way I felt. You know, my interviewing gambit was simply when you were with them, arguing with them when they told you what they had done wasn't so good. I could only agree if they agreed that it was wonderful. Otherwise, what am I doing with you anyway? And that's how I started collecting. I would go to other film companies. I'd say, do you have any old stills? And then I'd see this and that. And of course, these were images from films that I had never forgotten. And the collection began to sprout. I was very successful with these interviews. I did terrible interviews, I must add. They were terrible. I mean, I'm not being modest. I mean, nor am I... No, they were just simply terrible, because they consisted of an awful lot of goshes and gollies and embarrassments and bad breath everywhere. I mean, I had only just discovered the shower. One of the things I like best about America. And I mean, I was forever in a fever pitch, and I was forever hungry, and I mean, and I didn't know how to use my machine. I mean, they were terrible. They were really terrible. But what I did remember from, if you were listening to this interview, think, God, how the hell did you ever get into them? Why did they let you stay? But I wasn't aware of it in that sense, and it was so all-embracing that it filled the space. And it must have filled theirs too, because I did stay great lengths of time. And now I realize they used to open the window, but I never thought about it. It was a very dynamic kind of time, and I'd go back to the film companies, get more photographs, find others in the same drawer. What do you want with these? I can go and interview Sylvia Sidney. Okay. Do you mind if I have these Sylvia Sidneys? Because they're old stills anyway. Who cares? Miracle Man. I didn't even know she'd been in the Miracle Man. Well, look, you told me you had no old stuff. Now I'm finding 3 drawers full. You said you didn't have any, so therefore it doesn't matter if you have them or not. Well, John, we have to... Wait, do you really want this stuff? Yes, I do. Of course I did, because the previous 20 years of my life, or 22 years of my life, have been preparing me. You know, all those fan magazines I opened up, every time I opened the Screen Stories magazine, suddenly here were the stills that used to be reproduced in Screen Stories, which I used to read avidly. I mean, my favorite magazine, because it depends where you live. I mean...
You know why you did that?
Why I collected Screen Stories?
Well, why you were so involved?
With movies? You mean as a child? Well, I would think that nearly everybody who's obsessive must have a problem. There's no need to be obsessive if you haven't got a problem. The things I most remember from my childhood was reading, which I would do in the streets so that nobody could see me, and going to movies where nobody saw you because it was so dark. I suppose I wanted to live in this perpetual tunnel of darkness till I felt it was time to come out into the light. And there was an incredible education, because although I was the kind of reader teachers would have disapproved of, because I didn't just read what they told you, nor at the pace they wanted you to, so that you would never be ahead of the rest of the class. I just gulped it. I had no discrimination. It came with my need for stronger meat, but not because I suddenly knew a Dumas from a 15-cent concentrated classic comic. Just because you needed more meat. Frank Yerby led me to Samuel Schellebarger. Samuel Schellebarger led me to Heinrich Mann, because obviously I liked a certain kind of romantic swagger and panache, and in the end Heinrich Mann wrote it even better than Schellebarger, and both of them wrote it better than Frank Yerby, but I began with Frank Yerby. Actually, I began with 15-cent little comics, which the 15-cent ones were, I think the final edition was 143 comics, and you had classics of world literature, I was an avid reader, and reading was a way of keeping me blind, and going to movies was a way of staying deaf till I was strong enough to cope, and radio, when I didn't have something to read and I wasn't watching a movie, because we didn't have a television for a long time, I'd be glued to the radio. I mean, in short, I inoculated myself. I can say this now, then I was just doing it. I don't want to go so far as to say I had a miserable childhood, because what do you measure by? Anyway, I don't think it was. I just wasn't a very good child for the kind of home my parents could provide and the kind of world in which I lived. So I don't know at which point you start being an aberration, at which point you start being different, or which point you decide you're going to be different. With me, it started fairly early, because my mother used to take me to movies when I was 4 years old, and so movies were just were a key part of... I could walk down the street at any time of day and night, including crossing the streets, traffic and all, with a book over my eyes. Could do all that. I would do it. I hardly ever put it down. Also, I hated myself. I shot up. I was incredibly tall and so thin that I used to go swimming with a shirt on. I seem to have not liked nothing about myself, because everything about myself would be an intrusion into the world that I was into, But by 1964, I'm looking at these stills, and of course, bang, 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 bang. I can tell you the issue in which they saw this photograph and that photograph. And so suddenly I wanted them all. And the guys, they say, well, take them then. And I'd find myself in a place, I had been prepared for that. I really was ready for it. And it was one of the few times in my life where I was sufficiently far ahead of everybody else that I actually could establish something. Because normally, if you're going to be, I mean, the people collect things. People, when I used to act in England, you'd find people who collected old play scripts or this or that. But my obsession was the cinema, which was not a respectable obsession. When you're an adult, people simply think of it as your quirk, but you know what I mean. And suddenly getting all this material, and then I'd find negatives, which were being chopped, and because the same time that I started to collect seriously, or what would later on prove to have been serious, was the time when the companies were beginning to sell out, give up spaces, like Gulf and Paramount's big offices. They'd give up their spaces because they were too huge. They no longer had a big publicity staff. They no longer were making all those movies. Why should they pay all these salaries? Why should they pay all this rent? A whole basement full of old photographs? What do we need this crap for? Ask the lawyers. What do the lawyers care? Lawyers never care. The scandal of this world that we live in is the power lawyers give, given the enormous ignorance they have, because it is simple for a lawyer to say, destroy it, because that way we'll never have any problem with it in the future, will we? But what if it's history? Oh, well, let history worry about history. I mean, lawyers, I detest the breed. Truly, truly, truly. I detest them. I mean, given the amount of problems they give you, the first thing they say is no. Then they draw up deals that simply, that they can charge you hours on, They're the ones who have a profit. And yet, you can be digging by yourself in a cave for most of your life. 40 years later, you show them the splendors of Tutankhamun. Things that nobody ever gave them a thought about or gave them a damn about and didn't care about less, and you've done it, and then they still don't care. Then you start writing, you start pushing, you start putting on shows, you take them around, you insist on people, you say, no, this is great, don't you see why this is great? And slowly they come around to, and suddenly you discover you've convinced them, because a lawyer is calling up saying, where'd you get that? That isn't yours. And then somebody's son who couldn't give a damn, suddenly they're all coming out. Yes, you've done the thing. You've shown them it's worth money. And money is about the only thing that art means to anybody, which is why it is sometimes so frustrating for people who really care about something, because I feel you should make something for what you believe in. After all, why should you starve to death? But it's either money or it's nothing. So, I mean, it's a dilemma. It's a dilemma. So, anyway, in those days, the lawyers and the film companies had said, destroy. So they would say, okay, they would give the order to a man in some lab whose job normally was print 50 of this, 75 of that. And they'd be bored, pulling out the same box, pulling out the same neck, making the same amount of prints. They wouldn't care if they were good, bad, or indifferent. Though I must say, being professionals, they automatically knew the right amount of light that a negative needs so the prints would be good, and those are the kind of things we used to collect. But now they were told, what, we're paying for this whole floor? What's there? Well, you've got all those stills and eggs going back to 1921. 1921? Who needs that crap? Well, the lawyer says, well, we better keep something for history, because there's always somebody at the film companies who isn't a total dodo, who is actually a collector. Though collectors in those days, back in '64, doesn't it sound like, I used to always, when people said to me those days, they made it sound so octogenarian, but really, in '64, you'd be a collector, but people used to be hesitant about collecting, almost be embarrassed. They would hide that they were collectors of Alice Faye the way somebody might hide about their sexual secrets. I mean, really. And then you suddenly, well, I was never like that. I mean, and also I like the whole of cinema. And so the order would be, well, clear that space. What do we do with it? Destroy them. Well, keep 15 from each. Because somebody says, well, this could be history, keep 15 from each. But get rid of everything up till 1948, because we sold those to TV anyway, so they don't belong to us, and we don't be bothered. Now, you take a company like Warner Bros. Up till 1948, that takes care of your Davises, that takes care of your Michael Curtises, that takes care of your Humphrey Bogarts, your Errol Flynns, it takes care of your Kay Francis, it takes care of your John Barrymores, it takes care of everything that made Warner Brothers. It takes care of Casablanca and Seahawk. And so they're told, and Busby Berkeley and everything, keep 15 of each. Which 15? Well, you tell some girl, some Puerto Rican girl, a nice sweet girl who works there, who costs even less than the guy who's her boss, who's usually drunk or grumpy anyway. Take 15 off each one, Chiquita, and the rest you chop up. Okay, so I'm there. I don't know anything about negs. Mean nothing to me. collect a photograph. A photograph you can show to the little banker, you can show it to Sylvia Sidney, you can show it to Eddie Sutherland. I can't show them negatives. I don't know what a negative is. But you look at these things that shimmer, even there in piles, solid darkness, and yet you could feel the energy that's in there, the concentrated energy, which is what the nature of a negative, an original negative possesses, the art that went in there, the light, the thought, the concentration, personality exchange. You just felt it. You knew this was something, this cellulose thing. And I'd say to Chiquito, whose name was probably Maria, I don't remember these girls' names, what are you doing? Oh, you can see. What, are you just cutting, chop, so I pick up a strip. And I'd see, because if a neg is held a certain way, you can sometimes see the image in a positive way. It was the Hal Flynn and Seahawk. I thought, my God, these are things they print the things from. Oh, and take 15 off the top. Well, do you think Chiquito or Maria or Pepe worry about which 15? Do you think they go through 500 negs on a box from Casablanca and say, these are 15 really great ones, No, they take the first 15. The first 15 consists of Ingrid Bergman, Humphrey Bogart, and Paul Henreid looking at each other from 14 different angles. Right? So I said it's too complicated, but the point is that's when I started collecting negatives, without knowing what they were. And then I would find them in other places, and then people, it turns out, had them anyway, and I'd get them, and I'd buy them out in Hollywood. I was the only person I think who was interested in negatives. Then I started collecting color transparencies, because it seemed as if I sensed, without fully realizing it, that this world, that hadn't even been understood, was actually, literally, being torn away and destroyed. All the things that had gone into it, one of the key things, like later on, MGM sells out everything for $1.5 million to an auctioneer, who sells it all to somebody else for $9 million, who sells the whole damn lot for $16 million. Debbie Reynolds pays $15,000 for a pair of worn satin ruby slippers. I mean, that's what nostalgia and memorabilia amounts to once you've worked a long time telling them that the cinema is art. To me, a pair of sweat soiled shoes or a pair of sweat soiled shoes, but a photograph, a negative, is something more remarkable. There is there are things there, and that's how I started to collect. As I tell you, it's a Greg Arson answer.
Yeah, well, I'm delighted with the answer. When I was exposed to People Will Talk, which is the book that you wrote with the compilation of 41, was it? 41 interviews?
43, really, yeah.
Yes. Can you just give me your modus operandi? Why did you select the people that you selected? How did you go about doing it?
I've been working on a book about Cecil B. DeMille. Oh, great. I've been working on a book about Cecil B. DeMille since 1982, ever since I did another book for Knopf about Hollywood portrait photographers. And in those endless years on Cecil B. DeMille, I would get sometimes very depressed, because it's such an enormous task. I mean, the pharaohs had 100,000 Israelites. I was one Israelite building the pyramid all by myself, I feel. But nobody forces or holds a gun to your head. At one point, my editor, I would come back from an interview or something about the mill, I would say, saw Jetta Goodall. Oh my God, Vicky, you'd love Jetta Goodall. Vicky is my editor, who is nothing less than one of the great editors, one of the great ones, as any of her authors would tell you. And Vicky would just laugh uproariously when I would do Jetta Goodall. Did you ever know Jetta Goodall?
No.
Da-da, and would send little Hal Greaves out of the room. And then she'd look for him because he had vanished, because she didn't like any competition. Suffice to say that Vicky one day said to me, John, why don't you do a book of your interviews? This is something which, up till then, when people ask me for ideas about a book, my interviews with yours aren't scandalous, John. Yours aren't this or that or the other. And they're so full of many old stars. And who knows them? Who knows who Carmel Myers is? Never mind who little Enid Markey is. So the idea was, it was clear to me that nobody would ever care for a book of my interviews, except perhaps some magazines that specialize in old movie stars. But then why do all that work, And they're going to cut it, and they're going to mess it up. And here is Knopf, the top publisher in America, or one of them. And my editor is saying, I'd like to do a book of your interviews. But she says, I don't want you just to transcribe them, because she knew that my interviews as such would be a bit weak. I want you to annotate them. I want you to tell them the way you used to tell me. You know, what Tallulah did, what she was doing while this happened, and what you were doing, and why you reacted like this. Because I would always tell in a very elaborate. I didn't think I was being elaborate. I just figured if you're not there, I've got to explain to you. Otherwise, it might not seem as funny as it was to me. Do you have milk?
Yeah.
I took your coffee away.
That's all right.
You sure it's all right?
Yeah.
Should we put this machine on pause?
Yeah, just keep talking.
Just keep talking. Just keep. You're like Sumil. So when Vicky said, and I said, well, Vicky, this is going to be a lot of hard work because I've got at least 100 or more interviews, and some you wouldn't know the people, but they're really terrific, like Camilla Horn or Lil Dagova, who's German. Poor Lil Dagova, I interviewed her in Berlin, and I had to talk in German to her, and I would try to tell her how good she looked, and she misunderstood me saying that she didn't look as good as she used to look.
Yeah.
This is what happens when you don't speak the same language. And I realized there was something wrong there till we sorted that one out. But she was quite... So Vicky said, that's all right. You just transcribe them, and I'll read them. Well, I knew early on when I read one of my transcriptions, because I had somebody else do the transcribing, that the interviews just wouldn't hold up. They were too spotty, and the thought changes were too enormous. Well, I knew why the thoughts changed, but somebody transcribing wouldn't say the voice breaks, this happens or that happens. They would merely,
Yes, of course.
you know, and so it would read like one sentence which never made sense. So then first of all, I only had to do all the transcribing myself, but secondly, I then had to, besides the transcribing, I started to annotate them. Why the thought changed. Why Tallulah got up. What I was doing at the time. Why I should suddenly be so terrified. What this embarrassment was. What this and that was. All this thing. Well then, soon the pile at Vicky's desk grew and grew and grew. At one point it reached about 4 foot high, at which point she had 120 interviews. Now the idea was to do a book of maybe 320 pages or 350 pages, right? Instead, and she, after all, it had been her idea, and she had agreed that she would read them all and would therefore tell me which ones need introductions, as well as the annotation, and which ones wouldn't. But when the pile besides the desk grew and grew and grew and grew, because the more I transcribed, the more I got into it, the more I could hear their voices, the more I knew what Hawks was really thinking, because I knew I knew a lot about films, and I knew other things anyway, so I'd know what the pause would mean, or the shift, or the silence, and I'd bring all this to play. So that anybody reading it would be more interesting. So, as I say, at one point we had 120, and Vicky said, very accusatory, we can't do this. You mean you just can't give me all these things? I said, but you're the one who told me, just bring them all in, you go through them, and then we'll do the intros. At one point she got down to 67, which meant the book would have been 1,200 pages long. Then she got it down to 40, then added 4 more. Then she said, we're missing things. So I brought in Jean-Louis, who I hadn't even done yet, because I suddenly realized that Jean-Louis' little voice, his way of talking, like muslin. He talks the way Vincent Minnelli describes things, like pointing to things rather than telling them to you, you know. She very this. And I knew what he meant by she very this. I knew what he meant. Or all chinchilla, she don't like this. So he doesn't finish sentences completely, but knowing what he meant, the thing was to bring him out in such a way that you would also know what he meant without saying each time he means this, that, or that.
As the reader.
As the reader. And so I wanted the reader to hear them so that he or she also would understand all the things without always having to have it drummed at them or turned into an English that would be very simple and straightforward and finally deadly dull. I wanted each person to have their own tone because I was sure that if you heard the way somebody spoke, it wouldn't matter so much if they told you everything or not. Because I wasn't there to get directions how to reach the house on the hill. I was there to get something about what made people, what makes them tick. And the speech pattern reveals many, many of these things. And the voice does. And so I wanted to get the voices across. It wasn't deliberate, just suddenly, because I would forever be hearing how voices changed and why and what it hides when you do this. And what it reveals. So I had a fabulous time, and finally in the end, Vicky and I, it was now 50, then she asked me, she said, you got to be serious about this, that Matthew was working there, and I said, Matthew, do you like this one? And the moment he said, if he only half hesitantly said, well, okay, out, I didn't even, because just a slip of hesitation. Matthew, of course, was fantastic. You see, working alone, I can do it. I've done it. I do it. But to have somebody else who knows a lot, who cares about it, with some of the feverishness of which I did. So if I was stuck, if I'm alone and I'm stuck for a title or for something, and I walk back and forth my apartment by 10 times, after 10 minutes I may have gotten it, but I'm now bored. I'm tired. I feel I've achieved something and I leave. Well, when you have somebody there who says, all I desire, that's it. Do you remember the thing, I'm always thinking about her smoking. Remember, smoke. What was it? And Matthew would say, oh, you mean this? And he mentions Lady Eve. That's it, right? And my mind would run on. So, I have this wonderful person who I never was stuck. So, I never had time to get bored or dragged or depressed. I was just going on it was like having a safe fix. I don't know how fix any safe is. How safe any fix is, because you do tend to rely on their energy and their enthusiasm and their own little attitudes.
What was the criteria of selecting these particular? You had many interviews. You selected.
Vicky did a lot of the selection, but then as she narrowed them down, I knew that some people had to stay, and also I began to realize pretty soon myself. While I'm sitting there transcribing, suddenly Joel McRae says something about Evelyn Brent, and I remembered Evelyn Brent. And then Louise said something. And slowly I began to realize there was this interlock going on. That the past, there was always, somebody's future was always linked to somebody's past. And the present was always another way of, and it just moved on and on and on and back and forth and in and out. It became this wonderful kind of pattern. I began to see it like a Bayeux tapestry. And a voice, a thread there would reappear, oh God, 3/4 of the way across and down, and you'd see that same thread again. Somebody would say, somebody else, if they had transcribed an interview with Olivia de Havilland, for instance, and she'd say something like Enid Markey or Evelyn Brent, that person transcribing would say, who is she talking about? I don't know her. Well, let's just drop it because it doesn't mean anything. It's nothing to do with the snake pit or whatever. But now, there was Enid. It tied in. And there was an echo that all those years later, why would she remember? Well, I'll tell you why Olivia would remember. And so you get this kind, and you get a history evolving. You get in a kind of way where you become part of the weaving of the tale, and how everybody looked towards a future once, and nobody ever thought that they were a past. The only past people believe in is somebody else's or their past, but not I am your past. Just and so slowly they began to interlock and would expand. For instance, there's an interview with somebody who doesn't say much, but I just loved the tone of voice. I just loved the way she talked, and said so much about those kind of nutty broads who weren't really nutty, but who just have problems with language and were slightly, and got slightly lost along the road. And it would make such a nice tone in there, just such a nice tone that you'd want it, even though she didn't say much. And anyway, the point she referred to, Louise Brooks would expound on, or maybe Howard Hawks would expound on somewhere else. So that you'd feel the idea. So I began to realize that some interviews that were very, very small would actually seem much more than they are, because other people would be talking about the same subject, but you now heard a sound, and you knew how this person would tell it.
Talk to me about Louise Brooks.
Well, I don't know what to talk to you about. What should I tell you?
Well, first of all, she's become, and why do you think she's become this
a cult?
Extraordinary cult figure?
Because she started to write. The pen is more powerful than the word, than the spoken word. As any playwright will tell any actor, except with movie stars. I think movie stars are more powerful than the spoken word too. Well, because we start to rehabilitate, we start to discover. We all began to become archaeologists, and everybody wanted to find the Tutankhamun. And Louise was one of the great Uncas that was dug up, along with Nefertiti. You don't have to know much about Nefertiti to know that it's a pretty special bust. Louise, nobody saw her movies, but what a bust. Then the movies, how sensational. First the German movies. The less one knew of her, the more incredible it got. And the little bit more that would turn out was interesting. Suddenly she was alive, and where? Up in Rochester. What was she doing? Drinking gin. writing with a fury, learning how to read, learning how to look up movies, cursing the world, and, discovering a language for herself, coming back from the dead for herself, as part of the rediscovery that everybody in Europe was making. The cinema, the old cinema, even before TV, and before what happened over here, we knew that the past wasn't just a good movie that's been forgotten, and so you can remake it and we won't know the difference anyway. Not that I think the past is better than the present, but it's good to know about it and to enjoy it and never to laugh at it because certain contexts aren't familiar to you. Because the moment you give them, they make sense. That's what I tried to do again in the book. I tried to always give each person a context so that you would then see them in a contemporary sense and hear their past.
It's interesting that you talk about the contemporary sense, because my feeling when I read the Louise Brooks interview was that what makes her important is that she was a contemporary woman, way removed from the time that she was existing in terms of her
she was outspoken and her...
Yeah, and her independence and the fact that there was a kind of up yours quality to her attitude towards the powers.
Well, she wasn't the only one, though. Just not everybody survived it. And she happened to be intelligent, and she had smarts, and she came from a strong background that enabled her to survive a lot of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortunes that she invited to shoot at her. I mean, Louise never made life easy for anybody. I used to have long arguments with Louise, or discussions, but I remember Louise once saying, well, it's okay, honey bunch, it's okay, I'm not blaming anybody, I did it myself. Because it was more fashionable to say, Louise Brooks, the great tragedy of Hollywood, they destroy her career. And I used to say, no, it doesn't work that way. They don't go around destroying Frances Farmer. They don't go around destroying anybody. It's just another place full of this and that and the other. Because if the thing was being difficult, then Betty Davis would have been crunched underneath the ground so long it wouldn't be funny. She didn't have Louise's or Frances Farmer's looks. She didn't have Katharine Hepburn's, who was also pretty eccentric and cantankerous. No. I mean, the problem comes with you. But I think Louise's originality, we often think that people who are like us, we often think that when we meet old people whose attitude seems to be so much like our present one, we think, oh, how modern, you must have been ahead of your time, as everybody back then was in the land, Dodo land. It isn't true at all. She wasn't part of the present, except insofar as that everybody today wants to be so different from everybody else that we're all merry old idiosyncratic, iconoclastic, eccentric, original, wildly, I'm doing my own thing, and that's why there's so many crashes on the highways, thing number. Well, there weren't so many who did it when Louise did, because society was still more reliable, and the rewards, if you stuck to it, were good. Louise wasn't into those rewards because she had a very good Baptist upbringing. She had a good sense of herself. She was a high-spirited and rather tough-spirited, and she was not a very generous person. Not with her others, and thank God, not so much with herself either. She worked hard, but she wasn't kindly. Not only, she wouldn't suffer fools gladly, which doesn't make you very likable. So the fact that today we think this is just absolutely wonderful, I think we think she's absolutely wonderful for some of the wrong reasons. I like Louise a lot because she died and lived her life up there by herself, I thought, decently, and lived it with herself, and had to put up with her own company. And
how did she end up in Rochester?
Well, because a man discovered her, a man who... There are people, long before people like me came along. I mean, there obviously are. There wouldn't have been Eileen Bowles at the Museum of Modern Art, even though they're them, you know. If you were into collecting the cinema in the 30s and 40s, it was 9 times out of 10 a documentary, the field plowing the plane, or whatever it was called, or the plane plowing the field, or it was Russian, you know, because those are serious. For one thing, you didn't understand what the hell it was saying. That is always a great sign of seriousness then, as much as now. Pretentiousness has never dated. The same people who are pretentious in 1921 are pretentious right now. That will never change. It's just that everybody thinks, as part of the pretentiousness today, wasn't Louise original? Wasn't Louise different? Isn't Louise the most beautiful of them all? Well, for crying out loud, Greta Garbo was still pretty special, and Rita Hayworth is still pretty remarkable, and why can't there be more than one? But Louise had spirit, and spirit is always admirable. She can cope, and she accepts responsibility, and those, I think, are very admirable qualities, and she learned how to write, and she wanted only to be really good, and nothing less than being really good would do for her, and these are qualities which, to live with, if you were living with them, would drive you to drink, or to jump over the cliff, But, and she did drink, and she drove other people over the cliff. But if you're not living with them, and you're reading about them in London or Paris or miles later, you think, what an interesting woman. For short bursts, she was. Actually, she was really the man who discovered her. I'm going off a tangent. So people have discovered in the past. People have been interested in preserving film. But the way I like it is to share it rather than to put one more dunce cap on my head. And if you're going to preserve Russian movies, it's to make me a jackass. Me and all the me's there are. But if you're going to preserve Barbara Stanwyck, you're going to cheer me up. So I wasn't a total fool for liking All I Desire. So there wasn't something wrong with loving and crying over Stella Dallas. So she really is good. Why should I admire some bloody awful British movie, The Man of Aaron, or something because Virgil Thompson wrote the music, and Virgil Thompson wrote the music that automatically must make it better than what Miklos Rozsa did, except of course today we've gone so far the other pendulum that Miklos Rozsa is on the same level as Virgil Thompson, but he wasn't in 64. You know what I'm saying?
I do.
All these pretentiousnesses, which I'm forever trying to rip loose, and you're finding you're forever ripping one shirt off after the other shirt till you finally say, what does it matter? Go and see the damn movie, relax and shut up. But it's what stops me from teaching, or stops me sometimes, because I think I really don't care what anybody likes. If you really like something, and I don't, well, oh my God, you really like it, it's your life, in your opinion, I think it's totally valid. But if you start giving me hard facts about why something's great, you can just hear all the pretension bells rushing around the place. Anyway, you're asking about Louise Brooks. There's an extraordinary man, James Card. James Card, Eastman House, Rochester. James collected with the same passion that in America is breathtaking. In Europe, you'd find it. Henri Long with the Cinematheque collected like that. It is a movie. It doesn't matter. It's Sacha Guitry. It doesn't matter. It's René Clair. It's you name it. It's a movie. Great. It goes into my place. It's a movie. Movies, and he would show you one after the other. So in that context, at the Cinémathèque Française, if one moment you see Marion Davis in The Patsy, 1928, and the next one you see a Russian movie made in 1933, that first musical they ever made, and then the one after that you see, well, it's breathtaking, because then they're movies, and there's no pretensions, and it's just a wonderful time. And James Card was like that, still is. Eccentric. And he... because he loved movies so much, and silent movies especially. And James Card did something extraordinary, I think, for a lot of people in Europe, and as a result of which, because Europe influences in this area America much more than the other way around, he made Europeans discover the silent cinema in 1964, was it, or 65, in Venice. I always shall remember, because overnight the fashions in Paris changed. Everybody came out, Clara Bow, and Marion Davis and Joan Crawford, pow, 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 pow. I was sitting there at the Lavin show, and then I sat at the what's his name? The one who used to try and commit suicide a lot, but is okay now. Very famous. He used to work for Christian Dior, Yves Saint Laurent. And I would say, oh, Constance Ben, I could rattle off the movie. What Jim Card had done was he picked, I think, 12 silent movies with his favorite stars, entertainment movies. Not your Griffiths and things, Joan Crawford in Armada Maidens, Louise Brooks in Beggars of Life, Clara Bow in Red Hair. Believe me, that afternoon when Clara Bow was the first film that they showed in that silent series, all of them magnificent prints. So nobody had to cope with, oh, silent movies, you have to be serious about this stuff. But oh God, aren't they funny and slow? No, the prints just shone like they'd just been polished by a diamond merchant in Amsterdam, and now they were just bells going off, but it was a glorious day. So a lot of us were down on the beach. It was the afternoon. It was bad timing for those movies, as often will, at film festivals. The people who came back at 3:30 or 3:45 from the screen to us on the beach, it was raving time. Now remember, there wasn't so much of any of these things unless you went to special places. But to suddenly, in a festive thing like this, where Visconti was, where everybody was, and to have people come out saying, you've never seen anything like it, Clara Bow is it, not even realizing that Clara Bow was the it girl, well, the next movie you couldn't get into. Then they had to double the programs, and there were lines. It was just like, a film festival is a situation where the telegram doesn't have to travel far, and everybody was into it. It was sensational. Jim Carr had done that. And the reaction of that was that the success in Paris, and everybody writing about these things, the rediscovering Crawford, rediscovering Garbo in Single Standard, Norma Shiro, all those people, and Louise was already a cult then. So you had these on covers of magazines, And of course, with this kind of tidal wave, America could no longer remain superior. So all those people who like to sit on dead tin cans and pretend they knew something potent with it, in down there, had to get off their drums and start paying attention. But not immediately, because when I started in 64 and 65 and 66, I was very much a loner. There were others, John Springer, but John was into as a business, it was his passion, but it's along the lines of people who liked Alice Faye. It was a kind of passion, you talked to other people who were passionate, but you didn't do what I was going about, what I would end up doing, making a kind of a career out of it. His career was publicity for these old movie stars, and he kept it sort of nice and low-keyed, and it was reverential. There was Daniel Blum, who deserves an awful lot of something or other, because that was the first film book I ever knew. No, the first one was another one called, I remember when I got in the library. All this about Louise, well, Jim Card heard that Louise Brooks, who he'd fallen in love with when he saw her in The Beggars of Life and A Girl in Every Port, was living in New York. She was in a bar every day. He goes down there and they fall in love for a little bit of time, and he takes Louise back to Rochester, puts her up in a place. I can't go into his private life too much. Suffice to say, he does something very important. He makes her look at her movies. He makes her face up to there's more to movies than that crap I used to make, those jackasses who told me what to do. Oh God, that old fart, all he wanted to do was screw me. Suddenly she'd look, and he showed her other movies, and he educated her. He made her appreciate something, and her natural talent took over, and she became a writer. And to have somebody who lived through these things, now writing with such a clinical pen, so unyieldingly and unpityingly and so scathingly, but so fascinatingly, that's a way to become a cult without having to try too hard. We already knew who she was. We loved her in Europe, and her articles were so punchy, because also fan articles back in the 60s about old films were always wrapped in goshes and gollies and paper nappy. Really, everything was better then because it was silent. Everything was more lustrous and wonderful then because it was silent. Everything was like, it's changed. You think, oh God, why must the past always be so holy, and why must the present always be such a dump, and why do I have to wait till I'm 50 for what I liked when I was 20 to have been any good? That kind, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Well, that's what Jim did, and Jim brought Louise back, and Jim also introduced films because he showed only the best quality to people in Europe, and did it at other festivals, and so I suppose he was a big influence on me, and then because of him, of course, and Kevin Brownlow, who was another of those people. Kevin isn't much older. Kevin's my age, but Kevin is Irish. Oh no. Well, we should. I mean, it's yeoman.
Tell us.
Well, Kevin Brownlow wrote The Parades Gone By. And when Kevin was doing The Parades Gone By, and I was discovering New York, and Kevin would say, Kevin had a few precious stills. There were so few of anything, that just to have a few seemed to be so many. And the few breathed of all the others. And Kevin said, well, I was into portraits, glamorous movie stars. But, he said, what I really need is offset. But they're so rare, you can't find them. Bad production shots, people at work. Right? Every week out of the BBC in New York, I'd send Kevin a 20-pound parcel. There would be William Wellman working on Wings. I mean, there was Sternberg on the set of Dragnet. And of course, if people are husbanding their Alice Fays and their Betty Grables and their Ava Gardners for their makeup kits, who didn't give a damn about a silent movie, never mind a production shot? Partly, the fact that I would imagine that the way I collected, thank God I was fast, because there's nothing to raise the scent than somebody like me, who, if you get that excited, people may not know what it was, but they'll start collecting it. If you see a garbage pail and look at it with wonder and really get excited, you'll not only get a crowd, you'll get people going to other garbage pails. It's inevitable. I used to share things. Why not? It's all part of a wonderful world. You don't always get thanked for that. Often people start to resent you. Oh, was Kobal there already? That kind of stuff. Oh, well, you must have taken the best. They still presume this, not knowing that by now I must have the best. I just like to fill in gaps. Anyway, Kevin, I would just send in these, and I'd think, oh God, I wish I were there when Kevin opened them up, because his eyes must be falling out of his head. And Kevin was very good. He's, as I say, Irish, Celtic. We would look at movies. his 8.5 millimeter those or 9.5 millimeter those there was one of the ratios which usually you'd see French 20s movies on, and when you see things with people who love things with enormous enthusiasm and not like sacred cow time, well then it's you suddenly your eyes open, your whole thing opens. I wasn't into silent movies when I began in '64. I mean, my period was I'd say seriously 47, 48 to 60. It certainly, you know, I mean, Rita Hayworth was my big passion, but then so was Gary Cooper. Barbara Stanwyck was my big passion. But as somebody said, who is John's big passion? And this friend of mine said, well, what day is it? And he'd say, so-and-so, oh, well, then it must be so-and-so forth. I mean, obviously I like movies, but now I moved into the silent era. And then the German, I mean, I discovered, I mean, I put on seasons at the National Film Theatre because it's evident, obviously, from what I'm saying, that I hate maybe as much about anything, maybe more than is pretensions about things. Obviously, one of the prices you pay is you become pretty pretentious about disliking pretensions, but like all German cinema stopped after 33. After with Hitler, all the talent left, nothing good anymore. And you say, what a crock of shit. I mean, you think because people stay behind him because they cheer when Hitler goes by, all their talent goes out of their fingernails? I mean, God, artists are a strange lot of people. And yes, maybe they shouldn't work in bad places, but in which case, we better say the year we're fighting America, everything that's produced in America is no good because they're villains, or the year we're fighting Cuba, everything that's produced in Cuba is no good. I mean, what is this nonsense? All talent. I mean, a lot of people may leave, but people who stay behind are talented don't cease to be talented as a result. So I put on a season of German entertainment movies of the 30s. Entertainment. I mean, everybody likes to say that what was left was propaganda. Crap! Who would make propaganda? You don't make money with propaganda. The only country that made a lot of propaganda was America. I mean,
who starred in those films? Anyone we'd recognize?
Oh, well, the Germans were very clever, or rather Goebbels was very clever. Goebbels was sort of very much like Louis Vuitton, only of course he wouldn't have been nice to Louis Vuitton. Though actually, if he'd come over here before Hitler, they probably would have been, he was creepy enough to have gotten on with him. But money makes stranger bedfellows than politics. Gigantic. For instance, Dietrich and Goebbels didn't want to go to Germany unless they could shoot Hitler. Remember, you must have heard that. I guess I would sign a contract if I can shoot Hitler. Well, so they created another Goebbels. They took the Swedish singer Sarah Leander, who had a voice really low, magnificent, like the plush damask or plush velvet, when her voice, and only a fool would say, that's a man, because they're not listening at all. People don't listen, you know. People for years thought I was English. I was very happy with that, but it also taught me that people don't listen. They also don't look very hard. You tell them you're the son of Lord Dragogan 5 removed, and you have a cleft palate, and you're as English as oh, Lord Dragogan, you must meet, and that's because they don't want to be bothered. It is because, on the whole, people don't wish to be bothered, that there's so much of this crap that is being sold out to them, and people create institutions and they become directors of museums because they're good at finagling and politicking and adapting and schmarming, and then when they're behind the four walls, to which they have a key, which people with a lot of money and nothing else to do with their time give money to, so that they have a place to go when they have a party or a bar mitzvah. So now the head of the Museum of Modern Art, the photo library, says, this is great photography, this isn't. And I think, up yours. What the hell are you talking about? Or the Getty millions. Yes, unfortunately, money will always speak infinitely louder than all the hard work in the world. It will, and I can't be too bitter because I can make money, and I could just do that and then buy the stuff, ready done, and tell you it's good, or tell you because my money's on it. And if I pay $10,000 for a photograph at an auction, I will have said this is good. My 10,000 will have said it, and everybody else will go to their bins and pull out a photograph, and the 10,000 will have done what I, with 10 years and shows around the world and writing till my fingers drop off, won't have done, because people measure things in those kind of terms. So of course you get people who like to work in museums, because once you're in there, and to be in there is very political. Somebody has to answer the telephone. Somebody has to type. Once you're in, You start politicking your way around. How do you smile at Mrs. Rockefeller? How charming that you could come for this, and this is Miss Lillingish. Always at Mrs. Rockefeller, who did know that this is a famous woman. How charmed. How much money do you need? This is such a wonderful thing you've done. And the tea was delicious, thank you. Mrs. Rockefeller feels good that she's met an old movie star. They get some more money. The other people, the board of trustees, say, oh, you've done wonders. We must do more for your movies. There's no knowledge of movies. No goddamn care about movies. Maybe a little bit along the way. I mean, I hope so. Otherwise, they'd be bored to death. Or photography. And then they lay laws down. And because they've gone to college, they know how to write. I'm always a little bit resentful, to put it mildly, about my ignorance. I'm not sorry I didn't do good well at school. I'm not sorry I didn't get that school wasn't for me. I'm just sorry I didn't pick up those things along the way like A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It took me a long time to learn how to spell and punctuate and all those things. And thank God I have a brilliant editor and a good publishing house, and they have people who do know how to spell. But, I mean, it would have helped me too earlier, I must say. I mean, I used to write the world's longest sentence. Now, your question was not about Louis Brooks anymore, because we passed Louis somewhere along the line. And it was, what was it? Was it about photography? What was your question?
Well, let's take another question.
You've forgotten it too.
Tell me, as you talk, I get the feeling that you feel very strongly about the way the archives work, the way museums work, the way festivals work, all of these things. If you could produce the ideal school, the ideal training program, the ideal festival, what would you feel that it should contain? What would be the difference between what is presented now?
Well, that what you think, to me, is more important than the thing you're given to think about. That what you feel, what something makes you feel, is more important than the something. That we all need a discipline, because the reason we need a discipline is otherwise one goes over the boundaries and may not create, and maybe it's too hard to come back. I think art is there to open you up to it, not for you to bow down before it. I genuinely feel if all the art in the world were destroyed tomorrow, we create it all over again. I mean, I think the individual's more, I think we have put too much value and therefore destroy what I think is valuable about something. If I think something's beautiful but you tell me it's 15 million, I don't want to look at it anymore. What's 15 million? How can I possibly think this is $15 million worth? I just thought it was wonderful a moment ago, and it had nothing to do with 15 million. I'm perfectly willing to give somebody their due, but I think the order of appreciation, and everybody wants to lay down laws, and I just like to keep people open to know that what they think is more important than whether or not they agree. I'm not into agreement, but I am into people thinking honestly for themselves. If I were teaching and somebody said to me, and I said as an exam, well, sir, I don't think you're going to like what I'm going to say because I really didn't like this. I said, well, great, just say it, but for Christ's sake, say it interestingly. I mean, but I didn't like it. Well, that's all right. Surely you can tell me that you didn't like it in more than 3 words. I didn't like, what about? I mean, just use your imagination. And I would say, don't quote me. I've heard everything I've got to say. All that proves is you've got a retentive memory. Just tell me why you're stimulated by this or something else. Show me that your imagination's working, and of course I want you to know how to spell, and of course I want you to do a neat paper because I'm not a mind reader. I mean, I think the basics I'm very strict about because they're useful and they'll always be useful. But this dogmatism, this is and therefore, I mean, they lay down so many laws, and laws that are forever being changed. I mean, fashions keep changing, and because we and they become fashions because we're so dictatorial about them. Whereas if you open them, well, some things are in, some things aren't. But if the thing that's in is worth $1 million, then of course it's worrying if it's suddenly out and it's only worth $500. So things stay in much longer than they should because we have made them commercial, and we have taken away the fun of it. And the fun is what turns you on and stimulates you and makes you go. My bloody fucking photographs are worth money now. And I have to preserve that money so that somebody else doesn't run there and use it. Why? Because I'm paying a photographer. And I also now I'm paying, and really all I wanted to say, look at them, aren't they wonderful? Isn't it marvelous? Look at the imagination. Don't tell, this kind of thing. I think I mean, perhaps going to school in Canada may have been a problem, that I was in the wrong kind of school. Other people tell me they've had better ones. But I do find never produces these people who, the moment they have money, wield a stick, and say, this is. And he gets quoted in the LA Times, and he gets quoted in the New York Times, and we get an article in Vanity Fair, and everybody talks to themselves, but nobody cares. And the only people who can make a stamp anymore are people too poor to have any importance other than their originality. And it is out of that always that art comes, out of that always that fashion comes, out of that always that opinion comes, because as they grow older, their opinions are the ones that are shared by most amount of people, and the rest is always going to be swept away. And the few who arbitrate and say this and this and this, this and this and this is fine for me and you and me, but just because I think so, what does it matter? I've never cared if you agreed with me or not. I just wanted to show it to you, but hopefully in such a way that you know for yourself why you do or don't like it, not because people are impressed by so often by the wrong and for the wrong things.
One of the things that crossed my mind as you were talking was, for instance, Lillian Gish and her obvious, almost total obsession with D.W. Griffith.
Yes, well, it's her life. Mm-hmm.
In your meetings with her, you have met with her.
Yeah, but I didn't use her, I used Dorothy. You were asking earlier about who was in and who was out. For instance, Betty Davis wasn't in there. I loved that one critic said, the reviews are very good for the book, I must say. I was amazed. I can't say that didn't please me. It's just that I didn't worry about it. I really didn't. It was a great treat to be able to do a book like that. A great treat. No matter how many problems I'm having after it, whether with my editor or with others, nevertheless, it was a marvelous time, and there it is. Didn't I want a book like that? I've got it. But Davis isn't in for a simple reason. I just say one critic said to show that I was, oh, God knows what it was, to prove that I was, and obviously how waspish I was about Davis, because obviously she didn't give me an interview, and you can see his digs. As a matter of fact, she appears all through the bloody book, and you can write a book about Hollywood without ever mentioning Davis, and you can't. That's it. There are certain names you can't leave out, even if you... It was simply that the interview wasn't worthy of Davis. I wrote a very good introduction, which I really loved. It was an introduction about myself, though. Introduction about myself seeing the star and blah, 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 blah. But the interview with Davis, who knows how to talk, who knows how to articulate, who is a kind of Louise Brooks, Louise isn't that uncommon. It's just that she went through a lot of hardships and she paid her dues. And she came back from the fire. And she came back skeletal thin, and there was no spare left of her on anything. And what she said is what she thought. And, it was straight and direct, but it was wonderful. Wonderful. And she didn't like crap and pretensions and all that either. And with her, a discussion was what I loved. I said, oh, Christ's sake, Louise, I don't think so. Well, why don't you just be talking about it, that's all. It wasn't like, but I think so, you don't know what you're talking about. If you thought so, if you felt it, you knew what you're talking about. Quite right, and that's what I've always believed myself. And Davis has this kind of quality. So if you don't have Davis really talking, you see, if I'd had, at that point, a full tilt Davis talking thing, really, it would have been in there. It would have had a whole section surrounded by Geraldine Fitzgerald, who came out. Wonderful interview about Rumpelstiltskin. And, the description, I loved, I had such fun writing about them. It was such a joy. Matthew can tell you that. It was just like, I was afraid sometimes I would jump out the window because I was leaping back and forth in this endlessly large apartment. And the acceleration, and, oh my God, do you remember the way Allan used to smoke? Yes, Matthew. Right. And then I thought, oh my God, the window, stop. It was very exciting. Really a wonderful way. Well, I suppose if you get that, you can't complain, right? You can't complain about it. But, so that's why Davis wasn't in the book. Because it wasn't worthy of her, though it would be now because I've got so much more.
Why do you think you didn't get an interview with her?
Oh, I did. Well, I told you I used to be terribly bad, really bad. And Davis would say, with her legs were up on the table, and she'd say, "Oh, turn that off." Well, I'm going to say no, Miss Davis. I'll turn it off. You don't want this. Isn't not just because he was going to be gossip, but sometimes because you don't need this on. She just, for her, the interview was Hush, hush, sweet Charlotte. Yes, had a good time doing it. No, Miss Crawford was not out of it because I didn't want her. Oh, we're lucky to have Livy. Okay. Then, and off she went about Errol Flynn and Warner Brothers and Wilder stories. In 65, not that often already. Perhaps to her, but not that often yet to the general public. And besides which, the kind of things I knew would make people often go off on tangents, you see. When we would start in the living room of the mind, we'd end up in the kitchen, then we'd go into the back house, and then you'd suddenly, we'd do all this kinds of thing, and we'd just rattle on. And it was a wonderful, wonderful time. I mean, it was really terrific. Pardon me, I loved it. And Tallulah Bankhead had said that night, the night before, what are you doing tomorrow, darling? And I said,
were you a fan of hers?
Tallulah's? Oh, well, she was so wonderful. I didn't know anything about it till I went to see her. But then I seen, Lifeboat was not TV I didn't have. It wasn't. This revival thing starts in a big way after around. I would think that I'm one of the people who's behind this, in some sense. When I wrote my books, when I began, there were hardly any books. There was the Daniel Blums. There were those serious ones about the 53 books Mary Seton always wrote about Eisenstein, or the ones that Ivan Montague, whatever his name was, or Paul Rother wrote forever about, which always were books written about movies the same way there were books written about mathematics. You knew you were going to fail just by looking at it. I mean, you didn't have a hope in hell, and the only still reproduced from an American film, besides Chaplin, was to tell you that American films were no good, and of course you just loved it because it looked alive in the midst of all these Russian heads, which were picked deliberately to be really bad, because Russian movies are fun too. All movies are fun. It's just the way people want to teach you about them that often makes them so dull. And so there weren't many. And when I started, I know what there was because I used to buy them. And I'm one of the first people in there. It began in England, this whole book publishing on the cinema thing. It began in England. And it began with a few classics. You start with Gobal. You start with Hitchcock. And then it mushroomed. By 1972, I thought the whole thing was finished. I just couldn't see why it would go on. In fact, I made deals that were a song. I did a book that sold 250,000 copies, and I got £2,000 for doing it. I think it would go on, and then I hired somebody to run the collection, because I got tired of arguing with people on the phone who I thought were stupid, and I thought, well, wait a second, you can't run a business and think people, because they don't know what you know, are stupid. Hire somebody who will say, oh, hello, you want that? Fine. And I did. And so this guy comes along and turns my little collection into business, and suddenly you see my name everywhere. And I keep on doing other books, because what else do I know how to do? And it just, like Topsy, it just moves around you. And I know you were asking me something serious about photography and about art and about collecting and about teaching, and I don't know. I just find, and once you start sounding bitter about something, it's time you left, because there's no point to it. I think that's what Louise would say, and I think if you're going to be miserable, stay by yourself, because you know yourself well enough to deal with it, and when you're finished, leave, join again, but don't keep putting it on to other people. And if you did what you said, well, I trusted them, then actually you merely meant you were too lazy to do something earlier, and you've only yourself to blame. Okay, that's that.
What about someone like Parker Tyler?
Oh, well, what about him? I never read Parker. I read his sex books. His books in which movies
They're
were
all sex books.
Right. Yeah, but Parker Tyler, there were some, but there just wasn't much. You look at, by 1972, in 1961, you walk into a bookshop and you asked for cinema. It would be under drama, opera, drama, ballet, movies. It was more ballet. And you would find a Parker Tyler. They wrote in that way. You'd find Paul Rother. It was a staple. I'm sure it sold 20,000 copies in 70 years. But it was a staple. There would be Daniel Blum. Whoopee! That was for people who like movies, lots of stills. There was also one, and there was one which I still remember when I was in Canada, and it came out, and how I loved it. That was Griffith and Mayer's The Movies. Now that was opulent. That was the first sign, back in '57, of the splendor of movies and publishing about movies that was to come. because that was an opulent book, as if this was something important. It was stunning. You know it?
Yes.
Gifford and Mares, the movies. I remember when I got it. You know, I liked it so much I wanted more than one copy, so I knew that I really had it. I mean, very important. So I've always admired it enormously. And then to turn out it was Bob Gottlieb, who, of course, ran Knopf, managing out of Knopf, who had done that as one of his first things. He always liked movies. Lynn, I mean, I don't know. Was it about who was in and who was out? Length and space, that's all. Length and space, length and space. Enid Markey dropped out and she was adorable and you finally couldn't use everybody and they're all tied up. And Vicky said the cutoff has to be at such and such because I wanted to go on to Paulo Prentice, who I adored. I had a lot of interviews with people like Robert Redford, who I also adored, who I still do. And I still adore Paulo Prentice. But you got to stop somewhere. And Rock Hudson, really. I mean, really. I did an interview with him, and those two pathetic books about him, especially the one that was called My Story. Well, he proved that, living or dead, he simply wasn't good at conversation, because they had no more with the claim that I was with him for those last months. Well, you must have just been watching him looking in the sun, because he sure as hell didn't tell you anything. He didn't tell me in half an hour, and I thought, oh my God, this is like pulling nails out of teeth out of an elephant, you know, slow.
Was that because he wasn't bright, or?
Well, he wasn't bright in a certain way, and he hit a lot, and he seemed to be bitter about being. He had that problem that you encounter sometimes. They resent you for liking them for something they feel now superior to. And you say, but I liked it. Why is that? I mean, oh God, it was just crap. You just had to do one or the other. But I liked you in it. Don't you understand? You in it conveyed what you later on found in yourself to have and done. But sometimes you'll make that effort and you'll tell them that, and then they'll see it. And they'll understand what you mean. And Loretta Young will then talk to you at great length about Grand Slam, which wouldn't have mattered to her less, because she knows that you understand, and she's now willing to tell you about William Dieterle and Paul Lucas and The Floor and Warner's at that time and her age and what Dieterle said. Great. We're no longer going through you were so cute then. Oh, John, I made 50 of those movies. They mean nothing to me. You get the detail, you get the crunch, and you get what it's like to be 15 and 16 and the world is starting to revolve and oh. Well, Hudson, resentment. No, I wasn't discovered in a truck. No, I wasn't made thing. No, it isn't true. I work. No, I didn't have any say. Yes, I didn't do this. And you think, oh, for crying out loud, Rock, I'm just saying, let's talk about some of these movies. You seem to have disliked them all. Well, I'll have to tell you that the ones you liked, I thought you were a boring piece of shit in, because you thought you were acting. Acting, my dear, acting. I can see that it would impress a young, ignorant boy. My life wasn't so much different from yours. Acting is what you're told is an art. I, of course, believe that movie stars are in themselves an aspect of art, of the sort that possible only because of film, which looks into you. Acting is something done in the theater for long shot. Acting is what you do. Cinema is what you think. And
Or what somebody else thinks.
Who? The writer?
Director.
No, not very often. Yes, when he does it, then it's something so unique, it becomes Dietrich and Sternberg. But then the man's a genius, and not many directors go around being geniuses either.
Well, I'm only thinking of it in terms of people. I mean, I've seen editors take, you know, the director's shots.
Mm-hmm.
Kim Novak, for instance, you know, somebody with a limited talent,
Yes.
and cut it in such a way that
She moves.
That she moves or moves you.
Yes.
You know.
Sure. Sure.
I remember Miss Sylvia Sidney told me a wonderful story about was it Winterset or Dead End? I
Dead
think, sitting on a windowsill, which was just on the set itself,
Mm-hmm.
and the director said to her, all right, light a cigarette, take 2 puffs, take 3 beats, turn, look as though you're looking out the window, sneer, and throw your cigarette by snapping your thumb and your finger
Mm-hmm.
out the window. When the movie came out, there are a group of boys beating up an old Jewish man in the street.
Mm-hmm.
Now, she never saw this,
Right.
see, but when you have the scene and you see her calmly lighting the cigarette, looking with total disdain out and coldness out of the window,
Yes.
then it goes to the shot of the beating,
Yes.
and then she flips her cigarette
Yes.
there. I mean, you think, what a performance! My God, you know what?
Yes.
What? And that's what I mean by the
Yes.
director who may be able to,
Yes.
and the editor may create a performance.
That's right. It can work for dramatic tricks like that. It cannot work for the close-up, when we have to look at you, and why is it we prefer Sylvia Sidney to Andrea Leeds? Because Andrea Leeds could have done that too.
Yes.
And so could have little Joan Bennett, and so could have 53 other actresses.
Mm-hmm.
So why does it work more, for instance, let's say, with Sylvia Sidney, or with Nancy Carroll? Nancy doesn't know what you're asked to do either. And she's thinking, I'm doing this shitty film, it's a shitty contract, I'm going to get out of this damn film, I'm going to get out. George Marion says, is anything wrong, Miss Carroll? No, but how much longer is it going to take? Well, we need a thing shot. Okay. You know what you do, Miss Carroll? I know what I got to do. I've got to snap the sticker, right? Okay, right. And I hope this doesn't take much longer. Okay. Ready? Camera action. And she goes, later on you'll see all the bits you described. I have looked at Nancy Carroll and I felt the electricity flash through her. Dramatically, this works for the thing that we see at the boys down below, and that's one thing. And anybody else could have flipped it. It would always have worked. Nancy Carroll tells you why you're watching Nancy Carroll, even though she's also telling you why you may not be watching her much longer, because she's just a bit too fiery and a bit too difficult. And but by God, it's electricity. It is in itself part of the. I know what you're saying, and I know that it can be done. And finally, with Kim Novak, the day everybody stopped working their ass off, we all stopped watching. But we were watching, actually, at a time when there was so little that was original anyway. We were watching a great machine working. But in the 40s and the 30s, when this great machine, when people had to bring something themselves because there wasn't going to be this much time and effort given on you, dear, then you also saw it. When Rita Hayworth comes in and she meets Linda Donnell, and Linda Donnell says, oh, she's so important. She's what's his name's wife, Jan Cardello, what his name is. And Linda and Rita, yes, and Rita said yes. And Linda says, I've come here, I don't want to be accusing anything, I've just come to ask you something. And Rita says, yes. And you can see the tongue reaching the upper palate, the teeth going together, the smile broadening in a straight line, the yes just coming out like a snake uncoiling in the sun. And you think, where's the snake going to go? And she just flutters there and sits there and looks at Linda Donnell, who's as pretty in her own way, but not as exciting. And Linda says, may I tell you something? And Rita says, please do. And I think to myself, yes, the director can say, please, look, Rita, say, please do, but say it slowly. Say it like this. Okay, so little Rita, who's actually more naive than Linda Donnell, incidentally, who's already been married twice by then. Well, so has Rita, but it's neither here nor there. Rita was more naive. And Rita does, and says, please do. And I can feel a whole drawing room chilling over, and all the men, feeling their cocks shrink on them, and everybody wondering what's going to happen, what is going to fly, and at whom. And then Linda says, I know you speak many languages. I know you have been around the world many times. I know, and you have known many men. And Rita says, and her eyes slip together. Her smile becomes a perfect frozen moment. She says, go on. And I thought to myself, who can act it better? Who can act this better? Who, if they were doing the same scene, would I say, oh, this is just, how? Rita's 21 years old. I'm just mesmerized. I will always be mesmerized. This woman was an amazing movie star. That's all there's to it. She is what the camera is about. It's what makes the camera this unique instrument that didn't exist till 1830 something, but as a result of which qualities in people that would never have mattered and without which you would have stayed a woman who cleaned the laundry for somebody else, or scrubbed the floor, or become a whore, or God knows what. Suddenly we say, in you too is that potential. You just don't have it within you to perhaps, or nobody else will give you a hand to reach you out, but it's there. And the camera has produced a whole breed of people, revealed them and raised them. Because in all of us there's that potential for art. So I've never cared for anybody telling me what I didn't know. Great, I'd love to read it. Great, I'd love to know. But I'm not the less for it. I'm not the... No, because I don't yet follow this trend or about that trend, I might find it. And if you do it because you want me to share it, if you do it because you think it's so wonderful, you want us all to have a bite at it, great. But if you're doing it because it's the new in thing, I always want to say, oh, go fuck yourself. Because, I mean, who needs to be educated in a world that's pretty tough anyway, where there's so many other things you do have to learn that matter? I always feel art, whatever it is, should be given. It should be there to open you up, to reveal you, and to start confusing it with price tags and to weigh it down with price tags. I mean, I know things have to be worth something. I mean, it costs so much money to frame the damn thing. It costs so much money to move things. So I know they have a certain value. But when you start talking about million, and then it has to become 5, and then it has to become 15, so if the Mona Lisa, that picture ever went on the market, it would have to be 50, because we always know it's the most famous painting of all, so therefore it would have to be 50, because otherwise, why is our Rauschenberg 5, or Krankel? I mean, so the prices are just going crazy, and people go to shows and galleries, not because they want to, but because, look, now they're looking at silent movies with orchestras. I'm glad they are, if it makes them go and they're having fun. But they come back and talk to me. Well, I know about silent movies. As if, but you haven't seen it like this. Don't you know? I think, I don't want to spoil your pleasure, but did you really like it? Or did you feel like, well, once a year we go to church, and now we've gone to church, and we'll tell everybody else about it for the next month, after which we'll forget it again. You know, I mean, it has to be
Well, I think
fun.
it has to be expected that, of course,
Oh, yeah.
your interest in film is consuming, you know, in the sense that you have lived with this and written about it and adored it and worshipped it and all of the elements that go into that kind of thinking. And many people are simply respond to trends. In other words, they participate. I mean, when you see flocks of people going to the openings at museums, just
Yeah, oh, I'm all for that.
presentation,
That-
so am I. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
at least they're exposed to it. At least it'll influence them in some way. How do you explain, for instance,
Robert, unfortunately, I'm very late.
are you?
I am.
Okay, well, all right. Answer, let's give me one.
Okay.
In the 41...
I'm not as zealous as I sound
Yeah.
right now. I'm getting all fired up, God knows. I'm usually very calm, believe me.
I'll tell you what I would like to do, John, because I find this stuff absolutely fascinating, and it's actually the things that you allow to flow around your own brain that are the most meaningful and the most important. What we can do, in as much as I'm going to be in New York, and you're going to be in New York,
Jess?
why don't we just have another meeting?
Oh, I
if that's
love
okay
it.
with
I
you?
would love it.
And because one of the things that I'd like to ask is, well, I mean, I'm dying to know what you think about the longevity of Katharine Hepburn and what makes that work, despite all of the limitations of her
Yes.
physical being and
Yes.
everything that's happening to her.
And her talent.
And her talent. And, but many questions that I'd like to know, for instance, the interview that you regret that isn't in the book.
Oh, yes.
You
Well,
know.
and why is Grace Kelly turned into a saint? A woman who slept with everybody is the saint of Monaco, a farm, the size of a farm. We just love fairy tales. Here we live in this century. Everybody's so smart about everything. We drop dead from illnesses nobody even thought of 15 years ago. And here's Grace Kelly, who screwed everybody. God bless you, dear. I said to myself, if I had Carol Gable and Jimmy Stewart and all those people wanting me, or their equivalents in whatever, well, nothing wrong with it. But you're not. But people talk about you as if you were pure in the driven snow till that moment at the altar, after which you were Princess Grace. Princess Grace in 1958. Terrific. And Marilyn Monroe, well, she's the whole world's saintly slag. You know, saint slag, saint victim. That woman had a really great time in her life for a lot of it. I mean, but no, we want images. We want idols. And every time and when people today accuse the past of being so romantic about movie stars, right away they go on and do the same crap the whole time. And it's in this sense that I find myself to be a little bit of a basher, but only to make people think for themselves, and not to just keep falling and pay lip service, you know? I mean, I like people to feel and think for themselves. It's more fun for a start, and, it's more exciting.
Well, why don't I let you go now, because I know that you are running.
I have to make this.
And
may I make a phone call?
Of course, we can, if you'll give me where I can reach you in New York,
Yes.
because I'm going on Friday. And
You are?
Yeah.
God, that's terrific. I'll give you all of that. Let me
Right.
make a phone call. 2
Very
as a matter of
good.
fact, because I'm late twice.
Okay, all right. I've heard a rumor, John, that there's a possibility that you may take your collection and go to Moscow. Tell me how you feel about that.
Well, that I feel terribly excited about because it's, well, it'll be the last show I'll do. Last show that I'll actively myself do, The last show I'll think through myself so that I know what point I'm trying to make. Because if you do a show like that in Moscow, Hollywood in Moscow, believe me, the whole world's going to write about it and mention it again. It'll be the last thing necessary. I mean, I don't think it's necessary anymore to establish these photographers. Everybody knows them now.
Now, which is the group of photographers we're talking about?
I think it would have to be that period 25 to about 54, 52. When Hollywood was maybe not even as far as 52. It's just that it really maybe the 30s and early 40s to define, because it's it's when Hollywood was its apex, apogee, but also the reason it was that it fulfilled a function which it never has again since, and nobody understands when they say why are movies as good as, because they don't have figures within it that are so evocative. Because everybody keeps going on about movies as an art form, which always means the director or the writer or the cinematographer. It always denies the uniqueness of film. Everybody accepts the movie stars are a lot of fun. And the fan magazines and the pop magazines, and today the equivalent fan magazines, like people will always, and the very fact that they talk about the irrelevancy of movie stars' lives is why people don't take the relevancy of them seriously either. Anyway, I don't think they are like what they used to be, and you can't have that again. And once something's been done, you can have the echoes of it, but you can't have the real thing anymore.
What do you think that purpose was that made it so glorious?
Well, it was an accident, really. But movies were formed by a public will. It's the art form that was shaped by the audience. And since it was shaped by millions, the millions working in tandem don't do subtle things. They do huge, monumental things. And they were forces of spirit that slowly emerged, forces of very strong archetypes that arose out of this. I mean, you didn't say by what people went to see, they like sophisticated comedies. I mean, you after all played every variation because there's enough people, and you fill out every genre there is, and you repeat everything that's already been. But the one thing that was so unique to movies was the uniqueness of the individual who, in books up till that time, had always been a supporting player. Balzac is to me one of the first times, but that's only because my reading is very limited, that I found that the mass became the hero, became the dramatic hero. And the great characters in Balzac's stories are people who rise out of the masses, rather than Napoleon. On top of them, it's the Napoleons within, the possibility of you being a Napoleon, you being a whatever, I mean, characters like Jean Valjean, characters like Javert, these extraordinary heroes are heroes born out of ordinary people, need sometimes to break through a society that was so encrusted that there was no freedom of movement anymore. Where's the pause? And I'll put it on.
Yellow.
We're working here. That's what it's like. I put it up again. It's on.
Oh, good.
I just put the pause down and I push the pause up.
Well,
there's the trouble with...
remember the line in Sunset Boulevard? It isn't I who have gotten small, it's the pictures that have gotten small.
Yes, I'm sure she, or that character, only understood that line from its own egomaniac point of view, but in actual fact, it's also the truth, in a kind of way. It means that there was a time when what I had in me was more important than what you put on top of me, i.e. the star was more significant than the plot line. That didn't mean people became famous stars by doing a lot of rubbishy, banal stories where finally the only cohesive thing was a striking personality like Claire Bull, because finally if you see them just standing in front of a camera smiling and doing absurd things, you wait for something better, and if it doesn't come along, you finally get tired of them altogether. But the will that makes somebody achieve it, the will in them that you identify with, that's what was so unique about movies. And in the 30s, I think, which was a great example of it, when so many people, the kind of people who used to pay the 10 cents to go to the movies, suddenly had even trouble getting their 10 cents together, that's when you realized, that's when movie stars became more exotic and extraordinary and luminous and almost planetary than even before, when their popularity already showed you what people liked about movies.
I always felt that part of it, John, was that they had perfection. They were people with extraordinary faces, men that were extraordinarily handsome. They had qualities that removed them, and they became gods in their own way.
Yeah, but I only thought they were extraordinarily handsome or extraordinarily attractive because because it was willpower, it was energy, it was spirit, which then naturally you tailor it, you groom it, you try and find situations in which this person, without losing that quality about them that's attractive, can move handsomely. But I don't think they were great stars because they were also beautiful. Gloria Swanson is certainly not my idea of nor anybody else's of what one would call conventionally beautiful. Gloria Swanson just looked like Gloria Swanson, and a lot of other people who looked as... I can't say that if she hadn't been Gloria Swanson, she'd be unattractive, but she'd be a funny-looking little person. Doug Fairbanks was just a prime example because he was just boundless energy. He was just really energy itself. He wasn't one of them, in repose he wasn't that attractive. In repose he was a very well developed, but so what? It's the fact that he was always ready to bounce up, and that spirit of get up and do something, it was so American, and it just, all those other people who'd come this way, it convinced them that yes, if you have this attitude, if you work, even if you can't understand the language properly, this is all you need. And for a time, it was sufficiently true in America. There were enough examples of people who made it that even though already you had a social structure that makes it very difficult for the low to have a rise, because where would the high be if everybody else could be high immediately? Nevertheless, you thought you could. And that, whereas in Europe you knew you didn't have a hope in hell. The structure in European countries was so organized that there was no way where personal success would make you the daughter of a duke or the son of a baron or a minister of war. Those were jobs that had to do with birth. Here, the only birth you needed was your mother dropping you out of her womb. Even while it wasn't really perhaps any more possible than anywhere else, as long as you think it is, amazingly enough, that's more important. That keeps the whole world surging forward because everybody keeps believing it, and they did for an awfully long time. And in the Depression, when I look at those amazing Roosevelt photographs, what always strikes me about them, while others say, God, here was poverty. Here in the land of the free and the rich, people are just as poor as they are in Russia or anywhere else. And I thought, well, yes, but look at those faces. These are the faces in Russia that simply stayed poor. In Europe, they'd simply wait till perhaps the Depression was over, or there'd be a revolution. But in America, they believed that they could still become Jean Harlow. It wasn't that they wanted to become some girl wearing a lot of silks and being fucked by Louis Mayer or making love scenes with Gable, but rather that spirit of achievement, of success, of breakthrough is what people like that embody to me. I could be wrong, but that's how I see them. That's what Joan Crawford stood for. So when you say, well, these were very handsome people, Joan Crawford, if you see early photographs of her, it wasn't that she was plain either, because they used to juxtapose early Joan, a sort of a gormless girl with a little mouth, big eyes, just, oh, I'd like to please everybody, basically a kind of a naive whore or something. And then they'd show you a more glamorous photo of her 7 years later, so naturally she looks extraordinary already. But the extraordinariness was there anyway. That was her drive. That was, while she was still smiling supplicant, pliantly at you, and, well, I'll do anything you need, Mr. So-and-so forth. Oh, I just love all of you, so-and-so forth. The drive underneath became defined in her cheeks. It became defined in her jaw. It became defined in her forehead. It became defined in her hair. Everything about her was, I made this myself out of me. All of us have this me in them, and I've shown it to you. And she didn't do it by climbing Mount Everest, which is something we've always been able to admire. A human being who swims the channel. Wow, that's tough. That must be a lot of hard work, and not everybody's going to do that. Or climb a mountain, or things like this, which is also the common man, because you don't have to be titled or well-born to do things like this. Nevertheless, those were recognizable achievements throughout history, throughout mankind. You know, we've always admired these explorers or these kinds of people, and we've accepted them as being slightly unique. Suddenly, we've discovered that just being a Joan Crawford or Clark Gable was unique, i.e., that you are always unique. That if you can break yourself away or divorce yourself or somehow overcome the social structure that tells you a good education, hard work, open a little grocery store, pay your taxes, bow your head when you see a president, that these, if you break through that, you can be the president.
And you can. You know, I mean, there were enough examples in America of this kind of achievement to make people believe that it was possible for all of them, so it made it so exciting. And I look at these Roosevelt, these farm administration photographs, and in these people, with like these Dorothea Lange photographs, you know, the mother with her children, if I were to use a photograph like this in a show, because I must say, from the very first time I ever did a show, I wanted to do that. I wanted to do that immediately after I did the first show. In the first show, I didn't have the knowledge, thought of that, because I was just wanting to just show these photographs by themselves. But I realized almost immediately after it was over, this was the V&A back in '74, that if I'd had some of those other photographs in there, because the V&A show was primarily the 30s, 29 to 39.
Was it primarily Hollywood?
Oh yeah. Anime One, people didn't even know who the people were, and they said, wow, you know, the luminosity of these things.
Right.
And it's amazing how the luminosity, the lighting, the photographer's lighting, all this became so much symbolic of the, because light is energy, of the energy within, of this, you know, it's as if the lights that the photographer needed carved away all the dross of these people and revealed the light that they had, so that you just saw this fusion of energy and you saw these powerful looking people.
Who were the photographers in the B&A show?
Oh, well, the same ones I've always used, because Otto Dyer, who people don't even know, George Hummel, of course George Hurrell, who almost immediately stood out. I mean, Hurrell is so American. I mean, Hurrell is the Winterhalter, the Sergeant of America. I mean,
Yeah, that's a wonderful description, because that's accurate.
I think, he completely didn't, instead of criticizing them or putting little satirical like Daumier would, or like that Spaniard, you know, the Spaniard who photographed both the Goya, who painted both the court, but he also painted poverty. George was more like the Winterhalters and the Sergeants, and I see nothing wrong. Sergeant finally got tired of photographing, of painting the rich, and giving them the qualities of his talent for the price of their fee. Because they were just scumbags who thought that by being rich and being able to shop in the right place, they were better, and pretending at the same time that they weren't better, that they were just like what they'd come from, when of course it was a lie all the way down. The thing is, Crawford was always where she'd come from, and so was, so was Tom Power, so was Cooper, so was Jimmy Cagney, so was Robinson, so was Bay Davis. They were always what they came from. Perhaps that's why they stayed so strong and dynamic for so long, because the rock of them, or the ground of them, was very fertile soil. Sure, you finally grow older. Sure, you get tired. Sure, finally the image, the facade becomes stronger than the thing that created it. This happens because as your own energy fades, it's like you start out small, but one day, thank God, when you're weak and cold, you've been able to buy a house. Now the house becomes you rather than you the house. Do you know what I mean?
Yes,
it's not a best example, but that's sort of, so finally, but when they were young and their own energy and ambition was there, then you have these striking people coming out of it, these striking dynamic affirmations of a very common individuality, of a kind of individuality that society, that the social structure doesn't want to recognize. Because if you recognize that everybody who works for Ford Motor Company is potentially Henry Ford himself, then you're going to have endless anarchy, and they'll all break off and they'll all do their own businesses. And if everybody does their own businesses, you'll never have these conglomerates, and then you'll never have somebody in control of them. But the movie star was always, in a kind of way, an undermining of that principle. It's ironic, because each movie star says that each worker in a Ford company or in a Campbell Soup company is potentially capable of being an owner if only he or she realizes that about themselves. But then a lot of people like to be herded. A lot of people don't have that in themselves. That will and other things also drag them down. They get married too young, they have children too soon. Then there are other problems outside in the world which adds to theirs. And then their ability to think about this or to just go forth with their own thing dwindles away. It's one thing when you're young to have this. Most people by the time they're 21 already have started to lose it or to have sold out on it. So therefore, if you find somebody like a Monroe who at 27 is still struggling, you're getting something pretty unique out of it, you see. At 27, most people have already given it all up. They've gone in now for the ad campaign. Now they will buy the lipstick movie stars wear at 27, instead of still becoming one of the people why you use their lipstick. Marilyn at 27 was still struggling and still had the ambition and still hadn't given in. Because Monroe didn't make it till she was 27. She was still a starlet. And if you're still a starlet at 27, the roles are going to be, you're going to turn into Mamie Van Doren, and even that's better than what a lot of them do turn into, which is just these blonde doxies. It's just that after I saw the show, after I did the show, George Hurrell, even Laszlo Willinger then already, I didn't often know the photographers. I just knew that the images were great, so I just went by the photographs. And every photographer's in there. Ruth Haired, Louise, Bull, of course. You can't get out of Bull because Bull is Garbo, or Garbo's Bull. I knew that if I'd interspersed those, people would have really seen how dynamic they were. Because my point was always not to make a contrast at a time of such poverty, there was such riches. Because if I wanted to make that contrast, I'd show the poor of America, even now, whether they're lying in the streets and God knows what, and then I'd show photographs of executives of Ford, photographs of executives of Exxon, photographs of executives of CBS, all these power brokers, I'd show those. Then you'd see the contrast that is the cliche one of, in a land of such riches, such poverty. But if I do this show in Moscow, which I would love to do, because that would be, that would be incredible. We wouldn't talk about it, it would be just dynamic, these photographs would just shine coming from that distance. There, by showing this, you'd see that these are the people. It is these Americans, these poor, downtrodden Americans who have it in them to become this. This is the quality they have, not to become movie stars, but to become whatever they want to become. And the movie star is a symbol to me of becoming anything you want to become. Open your own business. I don't care. Make rubber, make whatever you make, whatever your business line you have, if you don't lose your drive. That's what movie stars have always stood for me. They haven't stood for, you too can be a successful movie star and become rich and hobnob with presidents and princes, but rather you too can open a business and fund it.
John, remembering that movies are shown in the dark, and people thus go to the movies and they are protected from the stimuli around them or people observing their reactions. How do you see that in relationship to the importance of movies, the importance of the stars, the fact that it was a private experience?
I don't know. I don't know what you mean. It was a private experience. You went to a movie and there were usually 500, 600 other people sitting there, at least when they were popular.
But in your head, you could react and identify with whatever you wish to identify. You could do whatever you wish to do with that particular star.
Well, yes. It's like going to church. You're in church during High Mass with 700 or 800 other people. You're not alone. You're part of a communal. You know that what you're feeling is not something hidden and secret. You don't have to be ashamed of it. At the same time, it allows you total privacy once you're in there. So there you can be with a mass and still be an individual. There aren't many organized places that allow this. I mean, usually a group where a lot of people are gathered together, they're gathered together to follow one thought. You're all going there to meet the president, or you're all gathered for one of those rallies, or you're lining up the streets. You all have just one common thought, and you don't think beyond that. You don't think, it isn't a personal experience, it's part of a mass experience. The movies allowed that kind of sharing with other people and within a total individuality, which I think was also a kind of phenomenal thing when it first happened. It isn't anymore because we now have it in so many other ways. I don't know what the replacement for it is. I don't even know if we need a replacement for it. I haven't thought it through.
Oh, I think the process still works it is less important and less exciting because we do have images that enter our lives all over the place, including television.
Yeah, all the time.
And that are very available to us. But I was terribly impressed with your connecting it to the church, because if you think that the church is a place to worship, and when you think of that period in Hollywood when we really worshipped movie stars, they were our substitute. That's why I said gods and goddesses.
Yes, it's true.
But they also were our royal family.
Before churches, before religion, which is always one day long, I think, become institutionalized so that you end up worshiping the trappings rather than the reason for the trappings, that one day when the reason for churches existed, this need for God, this just without any rationale, God will always exist because people will always have that before you even tell them. If you believe you'll be saved, even before you're told it, you have this feeling this has to be more. I think this is what you're born with, that makes you different from, even though you're going to die, from perhaps animals. It's the very fact that you cannot accept, on the simplest level, your existence without there being other reasons. Somebody says, well, you're just egomaniac, or why don't you just enjoy your life while you've got it and drop dead like all the cows in the field? Perhaps they're right, I don't know. But the fact that one should feel this way before you even have to be taught it, what you're taught later on is which church to go to. That's what you're taught. And then the messages. Sorry. I mean, so before that moment happens, the same thing with the movie star, I thought. I've lost the train of that, but it's just that...
Well, we were talking about our identification with religion,
yes,
the need for religion.
And in a sense, oh yes, well the reason we need a God, or the reason there is a God, and the reason we know it before we're told it, before we're then denominationalized, and therefore go and think God is this aspect of ourselves or that aspect of ourselves, like whether you go to Yale or whether you go to Cornell or whatever, before you reduce God to this is the better way of reaching Him than that way, that moment before, when it's all important, that moment is because God, is inherent in us. We are, all of us, that aspect that is God. And the movie star, in a strange way, reaffirmed on a more understandable level our uniqueness. I am Clark Gable. I am whoever that person is. I am that particular achievement. If in over a series of 7 movies, Clark Gable plays everything from a mutineer to a racing car driver to somebody in love with Loretta Young, because of the one thing that is common about him that remains his own personality, his own self, we can be all those things, and therefore we have all those potentials. And anyway, apropos of God, which I do not want to say movie stars are like God, but but the function of them is closer to what gods always have meant in civilization than to anything else. This reaffirmation of the I am that I am. I am. And yeah, it's just a show. It just gives you the sense of confidence you sometimes need, the sense of self again that is so often dismantled by a social structure that needs to be able to work, which is really always to be able to work where they call it for the greater good of the whole, but it's really for the greater good of the people who have the money, who will be the people who are good at organizing you, the demagogues who then become the rulers. It's always going to be for the greater good of them. And I'm not into having revolutions. I quite like, once I own something myself, I'm not about ready to give it away again, because I may not, as I grow older, always have the ability to create myself a new world each time. I suppose if you are a god, and in an ideal state, the movie star is somebody who can always give away everything he's achieved with each film role, because there'll always be a new film role, and each new film role is another whole new world. Does that sort of make sense?
Sure. I think that the area that isn't correct about it is that much of the quality of movie stars disappears with time. In other words, if the quality that you offer the audience to identify with is your virility and your masculinity and your macho strength,
and your humor and your endurance,
and you look ill, then they don't identify with you any longer.
That's right. Well, you're always going to look towards youth the way you look towards spring. Spring is the harbinger of all the other seasons, and so everybody always feels better in the spring, even if they're in their 70s. Just for that one moment when suddenly the elements are such, the combination of temperature and sunlight and the leftover of the cold, which already is being pushed aside so you don't even mind it so much, because although you're cold, you're on your left shoulder, you're already feeling the warmth, and it just nudges you and you're ready to take things you wouldn't normally do. Just in that sense, we'll always go towards youth, because youth is the promise of the security when you get older. Usually people by that point have whittled down in so many ways, they're sold out in so many ways, that they have fewer old symbols. But there are old people who also became huge stars, and that's because they made their age something virile and wonderful and still alive, i.e. you're not dead till you drop. And you just don't have as many because I think it's so much harder, so many other things get in the way. And if you've been a movie star for a long time, to be able to have that quality as you grow older, having been so familiar and so familiarized, which is another way of encrusting you with memories, which will then hold you down, where we said, I remember when she was young and I was young. For people to at an old age have the same quality in youth is quite remarkable, because it says that, so if there's a star, a real star, not somebody who plays a character role, but who still has that feistiness, that guttiness, well, I suppose Marie Dressler, late in life, when she had that second swing in her career, suddenly became one of the most popular, and by popular I mean people pay to see you. That is not, everybody says how good you are, everybody says how dear you are, everybody loves you terribly, and you play the maiden aunt, or you play some aunt in a couple of good scenes, but no, Mary Dressler was the star of the movie, and the young people played her support. Why? Because she was still so alive. She was still full of all the promises. And if you said, but Marie, you're 70, well, actually she wasn't that old anyway, but let's say the character, you're 70, how can you be so full of promise? Because you're full of promise till you drop. And it's why when we meet certain old people like Margaret Asquith, or some of those, these gumptious, ornery, brittle, tough, but fabulous, it's because they say, I'm 74, my foot breaks every time I take a wrong bend, I'm supposed to now be in bed for the rest of my life because my foot breaks? You mean because I'm old, I should only speak in a low voice and give advice to grandchildren? I mean, stuff you. And on she goes and runs for Parliament and gets into Parliament. We do idolize those people when they retain that spirit, but there is less of it, because more people by then will become like Nancy Reagan, a symbol of graceful old age, of modesty, of manners, you know. And so while society will admire that, it will rarely be a symbol in that real big sense to the mass of people, because what's encouraging, that's more like what you're going to end up as. You may respect and doff your hat, but where's the vigor about it? Where's the vitality? Where's the humor? Where's the fact that as long as you're alive, you have all the chances in the world, and that the chances are not like if you work very hard, by the time you're 50 you'll have security, but rather you're alive. That's the security. You're still looking at the things. Sure, the younger you are, they're always going to go for it, because then all possibilities are there. And usually young stars, though, if they haven't made it by the time they're 25, apropos Monroe, already you've turned off them and gone to somebody new, because they've already shown you that they do not have that kind of staying power in your interest. The ones that do become the huge stars, the mega stars, because the word star became applicable finally to anybody who ever had the name above a film. It isn't. It's only somebody you pay to see. Why do you pay to see them? Because they invigorate you. You can say, because they're so talented, because they're such fine actors. On Broadway, yes. Broadway seats a theater, if 2,000 is a huge theater, there'll always be 2,000 people to admire fine artisanship, fine craftsmanship, respect for the writer. The screen wasn't about that. The screen was always the writer, the cameraman, everything was supportive to the uniqueness of self. It may have been more difficult to find interesting stories in which somebody was always just going to be, I'm alive, I'm going to do things. Sure, they all began to look like formula, but as long as the person playing that formula was young and fresh, the formula was new again. The moment they just had nobody in them, just get some attractive that people know them, use them, the story moved along and thought, what a rubbishy story, you know. I mean, those become the B films, or those become those glossy vehicles that may just fill a slot in the market but lack the energy of it. Energy, I think, is the key part of it, and energy is not dependent totally on youth. I do think America respects youth too much without admitting it, for reasons that are not respectable. Because if you're young, you're young. If you're young, the energy has little to do with you. Also, we respect older people who keep themselves very fit because it simulates youth. When what I'm really meaning is people who are just so full of life, in which wisdom is another spark, rather than the wisdom which is really like a tax accountant has wisdom, he knows all the ropes. Murray Dressler or Wallace Beery or I can't think of anybody anymore. Those were not.
Lucille Watson.
Lucille Watson. I mean, well, those were supporting players, though.
Yes.
Those were supporting players. I'm talking.
But you remember them.
Yes, you do remember them, because if you've seen somebody a lot, you can. But there is the supporting player one, and there's the one who just says, I've got to see that person again. I'm trying to think of somebody who is that. See, Ethel Barrymore is actually, she always had a sense of humor, and I think that bit of humor always bubbled its way through, so that she actually remained she became a genuine character, kind of star, even if the roles she was given were dignified. The reason one went to sit through them, if one did, was because there's actually a personal bubble of original life going on. But I'm trying to think of somebody who just then came along, and we just liked them so much that they were stars, and you went, well, Lawton for the rest of his life. Age did not take that away from him. Ralph Richardson was always surprising. Gielgud, no matter how talented he is, he remains that laughter.
Olivier is an old man now.
Yeah, but here we are talking about admiring a craft. I mean, you have not paid to see Olivier in a film for at least 40 years. Whereas that is a case of admiring talent and dedication and hard work. I always look for that something that makes them alive rather than that honors their art. That, like George O'Keeffe was alive rather than simply a relic of great glory gone. I mean, I do want that surprise element. I mean, Betty Davis, wizened, withered, crinkled, cranky, is still a feisty old fart. I mean, you're forever being thrown by her. I mean, well, you may not always like her, but you're dealing with somebody who's there, who is not going to give up because you think, isn't it time you were respectable to give up? Don't you remember how we used to remember you? Well, that's your problem. It isn't mine. I'm not going to retire because you think so. And she's full of sparks, and some of them are still fresh sparks. They're not all from the old fireplace. I don't think youth and beauty are the only thing, but it's more easily found among it. But there are enough cases of older people who had that quality and were enormously popular for me to think that the quality of being a film star, this identification of self, was not just because they were very beautiful. There were some. I mean, Hedy Lamarr, why was she a movie star? Well, not because she was such a great actress, because she wasn't a bad actress. But if she had been a plain girl, as talented as she was, Hedy Lamarr would have been working. She'd be working in theaters. People would respect her because she wasn't bad at all. She simply wouldn't have been. Well, that's why I don't like. It's the phone situation. I mean, look, I'm getting very preponderous and very philosophical, and I really. That's just where you can lead on to
Right.
We're going mad, but it's not where my head is the whole time. I just like the idea of doing a show in Moscow with those Roosevelt photographs, because then you'll see America.
Let me go back to something that you said about George Hurrell and the luminosity of those photographs.
Yeah.
Now, George Hurrell is still alive, I suspect.
Still alive, 86 cantankerous old shit. I should say this. Cantankerous, not very. Yeah. What about it?
Well, I was going to ask you to contrast him to people today who are photographing our so-called celebrities. Someone like Annie Leibovitz, for instance, who produces books.
Yes.
How would you contrast? I mean, I'm looking at the wall here in your New York studio and reacting to the Hurrell picture of Johnny Weissmuller, Norma Shearer. They're quite extraordinary and really wonderful. And they give you a whole sense of the true value of portraits.
Yes.
You get a feeling that you are privileged to feel the magnificence and the power of that particular individual. And going back to what I said earlier, the perfection of them.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
In Annie Leibovitz, well, you tell me what you think of. Do you think she does portraits?
Well, if she does, I haven't seen them yet. I think she does cartoons. She does little sketches. She does little playlets. And I say to myself, if I didn't know who the people were, and I was in some strange place and saw them, they would probably amuse me as photographs, a lot of them. I might even find them pretty because she's very talented. But would I know who the people are? Would I know much about them? Would I be able to tell you what they did for a living? Would I be able to tell you why she photographed them? I don't think so. I don't think seeing Bette Midler sprawled over a piano, however that one is, or Clint Eastwood tied up, or Michael Douglas in bed, I don't think, with his wife and child, I don't think I'd know what they did for a living or why she photographed them, other than that she had these models who would do what she wanted. Whereas, the uniqueness of the Hollywood portrait was, they told you about a certain breed of people who, if you think about, again, distancing yourself from them, being in some strange place where they're presented to you, you would, first of all, you'd say they must have been gods, because they do all look so extraordinarily dynamic. They're all such dynamically fused presences. They all, as you say, their unique quality becomes something that is immaculated, you know. But it is their unique quality that is made remarkable rather than just their physical contours, because that's the difference between a photograph of a Lauren Hutton or a Twiggy wearing a hat or a dress or a tooth ad and Norma Shearer or Marlene Dietrich or Carol Lombard, who might also wear a hat and a dress, but the hat and the dress would only always be an extension of their uniqueness rather than they model for it. I would think that if I were sitting somewhere in a faraway place and you showed me a pile of Willinger's pictures, those extraordinary gables he took, or Vivian Lee's, or Ted Allen's, or Bull's, I know so much, so it's hard, but I would think, just from the way, looking at them even now, their simplicity on one hand, and their strength, I think finally my mind would work out after getting over, maybe I'd start off by saying they were gods, if I knew nothing else. But then I'd also know what areas they were the god of, whether it was the god of fire, or the god of war, the god of laughter. You begin to recognize this, and if you had you might, well, you'd know that they would have been special human beings. You would sense that, because these photographs are about what makes them special. These are photographs of achievers at a moment of achievement. They are photographs not of, I've got Hillary, let me do a funny photograph of Hillary, maybe something amusing, I know he climbs mountains, and so you get a funny Annie Leibovitz photograph, or you get Hillary standing around a lot of mountains by Arnold Newman, so you know that he's a mountain climber. You'd have him standing on an Alp, perhaps. Always you'd know because of the props. If a Hollywood photographer had done Hillary, he'd be photographing the reason that drives Hillary, and the reason we are excited by him, and that would be the moment when he's on top, and the sweat of the strain, and the glow of the achievement, and the awareness of the impossible, and the beginning of the disillusion, because you've got to come down again, and after you've come down, after everybody's applauded it, what you do for an encore. All those would be crystallized into an image that shows you a man who has triumphed. And that's what the photograph would be about, and that's what you'd get, and that's why it would be, for me, almost spiritual, and certainly exhilarating. You'd be photographing the achievement, not shooting them on climbing, that's documentary, or doing it, in their home with perhaps some models of the Alps around them or the Himalayas. You'd be photographing the thing that drives you, and the thing that drives you becomes their face, because you can't disembody the spirit in you and photograph a lot of shadows and say this is the shadow of Crawford, this is the spirit of whoever the star is of Davis.
Is there a relationship between the portrait painters of the 18th century, 19th century, and people like Hurrell or Laszlo Willinger?
Oh yes, but in the best sense, not in the sense of not in the sense that you can take as good a photograph of somebody as you can do a painting. Maybe later on I have to call London and let them know, because that's what the phone call was about earlier. Well,
I was asking you.
There are society painters who simply do a nice, flattering image, but there are great painters who happen not to find painting beautiful people or painting success unworthy of their talents, like Romney, who got very turned on by Emma Hamilton, and kept transfigurating her in his paintings because he was so turned on by her beauty. But you only turn on by somebody's beauty if you also find their character stimulating. Nobody just paints unless it's just a hack because you're very pretty, because then you're doing models. You're just doing models. You're always doing character. Of course, if somebody's very beautiful, by beautiful you always mean a sexual beauty, though. You don't just mean a placid, marbled, detached. You mean always where there's a sexual spirit about them. And Sargent's painting of Madame X is a great painting, and and that's where I could see a Hurrell. I mean, you get into the something of something, and then having found it, you make it so classy that it catches everybody's eye. The great portrait painters, like the Winterhalter, who obviously was not a hack, even though he did the kind of things that people say, well, he paints queens the whole time in miles of tulle and lace and diamonds in the hair. I'd say, yeah, but he actually made those yards of lace and tulle and diamonds in the hair a representation of how we feel about that kind of thing. So he's really, and some queens and empresses may have the spirit or and he finds the combination, and what you get is not a beautiful picture of a stately royal thing, but something that is the spirit of it as well as representing the person who it is, so that you really get carried away, which is why 80 years, 100 years later, that painting of the Empress of Austria, Elizabeth, a boring little woman in many respects, nevertheless for a time she caught the spirit of the world with her beauty. We always say her beauty because you can't, I mean, that's how it's always broken down. Oh, this is just too terrible. I don't know what to do. I think take the phone off the hook again, but there are problems involved. And I find, tell you the truth, Bob, I find that I always get so highfalutin. I don't know, I would like to be able to be much more simple about these things. Much simpler.
About talking about them?
Well, because I just like them. I mean, I didn't go into it because I thought, I'm talking as if I were trying to convince people that these are great by using a lot of highfalutin things and references to famous artists so that it's taken seriously. I did that in my book anyway. And even then I said to myself, why does one always have to sell out to say the obvious? Why can't they have been great without my studying up on art history and tracing things so that somebody reading it would say, maybe he's right because he's done all this work and I haven't done it yet. I mean, why can't I have just said, but don't you realize it's a great photograph of Joan Crawford anyway, and don't you realize that makes it a great photograph? And so it isn't Arnold Newman photographing Laurence Olivier or Karsh photographing Churchill. That doesn't make it greater because you read about Karsh in New York papers. I mean, don't you realize just because 50 billion people liked Betty Davis doesn't make it a less great photograph? But so I end up doing all this crap work, learning about Praxelotes, talking about Greek sculpture, talking about man's continual, not obsession with, but appreciation of beauty as a representation of spirit rather than just as something detached. I mean, Helen of Troy must have had a lot of energy, her beauty, because 1,000 ships went off to get her back, so she must have been an extraordinarily wank. You see? You don't go off that because she's such a pretty girl. Power is very wanky as well.
Well, look at it this way, though. Your position as an archivist has placed you in the position of an authority. And as an authority, if you were only a person that said, yes, I think so and so and so and so and so and so are good photographers, the interview would be over. The value of an authority and somebody that's had the broad experience that you've had and your close contacts not only with the photographers but with the stars they photographed gives you an insight and a perception that can bridge and contain its relationship to other art forms, and should, because who better is qualified to make these comments than you?
I think it's the pretentiousness of the way I find myself sounding, which is a pretentiousness I've always disliked so much when I've heard other people. Maybe that's me again thinking, oh God, I have to go back to school after all. I do have to learn things, otherwise I'm just mumbling. But even my inarticulate mumbles are, I mean, I know what I mean. Why do I always have to spell it out? And I suppose it's the work that's applied to it, and then the work trying to pass it off as something that you would know if you spent 2 minutes on it as well. I like to make a lot of knowledge very easily accessible, so that you're not bogged down with reading 5,000 footnotes on Van Gogh's flowers, but rather that you say, God, I like him, and I say, you have very good taste, but I don't know anything about art, but I like that. My dear, you don't have to know anything about art. The whole thing about art is that if you feel it, that's why it's art. Now, it isn't art because we tell you about the man cutting his ear off and not making a cent, or being miserable and being a lunatic, or Rembrandt going to the dogs and still keeping on painting. The whole thing about art is it always transcends needing to know. You're not talking about art now, you're talking about the value of the dollar and how it's risen in 300 years. I mean, if you look at Crawford and you say, God, that's really great, why then do you have to say, but isn't $700 a lot of money? I mean, it isn't after all Winston Churchill. And I say, my God, you...
$700 is what that particular photograph would cost now.
Oh no, those Hurrells are $1,500 really, because he printed them himself. I mean, those other problems then involved, there are reasons why things cost more. Printing costs have gone up, paper's gone up, and the photographer may not want to print them anyway, and he lives in California and I don't, and getting them to printed is already a big thing. That's his time. His time must be worth something, because he could go and do a photo session and get $5,000 for it. Also, there's so many other factors involved, and then he signs it for you, because if you're more impressed if the signature's there, if you don't think a Rembrandt's any good without his name on it, unless the alternative being that 50 major museums all say, but it is a Rembrandt, so that you can always say, it isn't signed, but it is a Rembrandt. If it isn't worth it to you without getting all those credentials, then maybe it wasn't that good. Then you're buying a name. I like the spirit, I like the talent.
No, it doesn't mean that it wasn't that good. It may mean that your set of values are different, or that your perception is
The investment thing, yeah, the investment thing. I mean, I went to this lecture the other day, and I was very pleased, and it was a lecture about portraiture, and there was Arnold Newman talking about and showing his portraits, and Leowitz talking and showing her portraits. Abe Freundlich, who's going to be very well known, and he's moving there fast, showing his portraits. And everybody listening to these famous people who are already famous, and they've recognized a lot of photographs. And yet these are all students. It's the IPC, the International Photography Center. Nevertheless, they have this response. They're seeing famous people, talking about famous people, and they're quite in awe of it. And when the whole thing is finished, any questions? Everybody sat there because nobody knows how do you talk to famous people. What's the first question? Because mostly people don't want to know anymore. They want to be entertained. But okay, since something was happening, and one of the questions had to do with light meters and the difference between film in a camera and film for a movie, and Annie Leowitz said, "Do you understand this? I don't know what the hell he's talking about." And we laughed. And then I said, "Well, my question may not make much sense either." But then fine, and I just finally I just had to say this because I was thinking about these kind of portraits, which to me are portraits. They tell you something about that person, and in the unique sense, they tell you something about what the world must have been like at that time for these people to look like this.
You're talking about the Hurrells and
The Hurrells, the Willingers, the Ruth Hadleys, the Bulls. And I said, well, I've seen all these pictures up there that you've just shown, and they're photographs in which people appear, but that doesn't make them portraits. I mean, a portrait has to tell me something about the subject. I said, when I saw your photographs of people I didn't recognize, and I met Newman's and everybody else's, I thought what nice pictures they were. Sometimes what wonderful pictures they were. The moment I saw anybody I recognized, with very few exceptions, I thought, there's so little there, there's so very little that what I'm seeing is about 87% of you, who you are, the photographer, and your reputation, and the demands of your art editor, but very little of the subject. So I thought, these aren't portraits, you're simply using famous people to do little playlets or little funny things, because we all at that moment in time knew who they were, and we would be surprised to see them doing it. But we don't know even who they are and why we should be surprised. If, as I said earlier, if you took them away from that, I said, these aren't portraits to me. And it came out rather slowly because I wasn't sure what I was going to say, but when I finished saying it, the amazing thing was, just about everybody had agreed with it. That's what everybody later on said, that kept coming up and saying, what do you do? Who are you? Well, I wasn't going to go into that, but why, but you're right. I wanted to ask that question. I was going to ask that question. That was the very question I was going to ask, but I'm so glad that I speak for the common man. But it's I know what a portrait is, and the artist must lend his talent and his own uniqueness, if you're going to do a portrait of another human being, if you're going to do a portrait, to reveal that talent and that uniqueness. That's what will make the final thing special. A Rembrandt portrait will not be like a Titian portrait, but it will still be a portrait of that person, added the insights and feelings of a Rembrandt or a Titian. Yes, they're key in it, but their quality is given to bringing, because of their compassion, of their humanity, of their humor, of maybe they know the person they painted, that they will bring it out so that you know something, and you may want to know that person afterwards. I didn't want to know any of the people Annie or Newman or Abe had photographed. Hardly any of them. I wanted to know hardly any of them because they all seemed, because I was seeing what they were doing, and maybe if I all the photographs together made me say, oh, I'd like to meet Annie Leowitz. It did not make me say I wanted to meet this particular Clint Eastwood. And whereas when I look at the Willingers of Vivian Leigh, cantankerous, strange, hiding, lashing out, looking at you from a distance, even while you think you can touch my body, you think you can touch my face, you can never touch my mind. And yet she's a human being, and we know we think like this too, and we relate to it, and we're intrigued. We're intrigued by the complexity of this human being, and that this complexity has become something so beautiful. All right, Vivian Leigh wasn't ugly to begin with, but in her case, the more you concentrated on her beauty, the more you concentrated on her character, so that it was something quite riveting. And when I look at some of Hurrell's shots, or whether it was of Marie Dressler or of Carol Lombard, who I obviously liked a lot, and in the end, Hurrell's style. The great thing about Hurrell was, when he had a great subject, his style was there to suit them, and their uniqueness stood out. When Hurrell photographed somebody who was unknown, his style swamps them. A Hurrell photograph of somebody today, whether it's me or Anita Page back then, somebody who didn't have it, who was simply under contract, who had to work, is a photograph. Oh, that's a Hurrell. That's all that heavy lighting, huh? All that sexy, alluring lighting. But who is she? You don't mind. She's a pretty girl. The style was stronger than the subject. But every time he had a strong subject, Rita Hayworth didn't submerge into Hurrell's lighting. Rita Hayworth, just another facet of Hayworthness was revealed by Hurrell, whereas Whitey Schaefer would have brought out something else in her. But they would all have been aspects of the Rita Hayworth we knew, liked, and identified with. As you see, this is quite a...
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yes. This is basically a quiet day. You know what I'm driving at, though? What I'm saying?
Yes. Just to move in another direction, John.
Yeah.
I know that the collection of interviews that you did, which you published in People Will Talk, some of them seem to have an extraordinarily strong quality. I remember really feeling that I got to know Irene Dunn from reading the interview.
It's a very slight interview, though. The woman Irene Dunn.
But tell me about her.
Well, it's a very slight interview, but I liked her so much that I wanted her in there anyway. And I thought in her case, this incredibly, on the screen, open, charming. Oh, I would like to go on a long holiday with Irene Dunn, because not only would everything be neatly prepared, but you would never feel the effort behind it. It would always be, some people are good at certain things, and she would do it and she wouldn't make you feel, why am I the one who's doing it? She would simply have done it. And if you don't appreciate it every day, you will, if you sometimes look back, think, aren't I lucky that this woman was along? Just a wonderful quality. When she laughed, she made you seem, she never seemed to laugh at you, though she may have sometimes laughed because of you, and sometimes at absurdities, but never mean, and yet never dull. There's so many qualities about her that I so liked, and yet in person, or not yet, or rather not, and yet in person, but in person, well, she's not with everybody going to just pour herself out. She's a very graceful lady. She's not just going to let anybody walk into her life. She's not making a film. A lot of things that are very important to me aren't that important to her. And I found that this in no way lessened the truth of what I felt about her on the screen. But there she was playing a whole human being with many facets, which for this particular role they brought this one or that one out. And what I now saw, it wasn't that those didn't exist except for her work. Simply, she didn't go on about her movies very much. She didn't like a lot of them. She didn't think movies were the most important things in her life. She knew they meant a lot. She had a good time, and she had enough spirit that when you said the right thing by mistake, just the way she talked about Miss Davis winning Oscars, because to her era was the same era as Betty Davis's, and Betty Davis in the 30s and 40s was the symbol of preeminent acting in an industry where, just like photography was not highly regarded on the outside of what happened in Hollywood, so Hollywood acting was not regarded highly on the outside, where they used Broadway as a standard. Perhaps all great actors on Broadway, the Tula Bankers, the Ethel Barrymores, the John Barrymores, all knew that those people who worked in Hollywood studios were really very, very good actors. It was just their popularity that made people judge them so lightly. And the subject matter in which they appeared made people judge them so lightly. But they knew that it's just as hard a job to be Carol Lombard in a piece of frou-frou as it was to play Richard III. I mean, in Richard III, it's written for you. I mean, then it's a case of how well you've learned your craft. There, it's why you're worth watching in Richard or anything else in Hollywood type thing. So, I mean, people like that did appreciate it. But anyway, when Betty Davis was the great thing, that's Irene Dunn's era. And of course, Irene Dunn was often nominated but never won, because part of her acting is to make it seem utterly nothing to do with acting. It was just that you were always watching home movies, rather attractive home movies, to be honest, and home movies set in the Old South, and home movies set in back streets, and God knows, but she always made them feel like they were home movies. I mean, this was part of the extraordinary enchantment of this woman. Well, in person, she was also older, and I was late one day, and then the other day we totally missed each other, which she's very a stickler for punctuality, and it wasn't my fault that day. But can you explain it anymore after that? Well, you see, I liked her so much. So at any rate, at one point when I mentioned something about acting, suddenly a spark flew. Well, of course, I wasn't that kind of actress, meaning showy, who did things that the Academy would realize was also acting. that's why she didn't get any Oscars. It was the only moment there was a kind of a little bit of a, well, I did take my career seriously, of course, even though I don't like to necessarily talk about it. It did come through. It wasn't a very profound interview because she, as I said, even though I spent a long time with her, things were about other things. And it wasn't because I was moving around, it was because she would always move into other areas that interested her more. No reason for hiding, just levels of interest. And the movies, when I'd say, oh, I love this movie, she didn't like it. I love this movie, she didn't like that. And finally I said, well, now, why didn't you like Backstreet? Oh, well, the subject, a woman. But I said, you were so wonderful. Well, yes. But anyway, she said, my mother was ill at the time. And I really wasn't thinking much about it. And then, High, Wide, Handsome, you didn't like it. No, well, it was meant to have been Gary Cooper. And I remember my husband was ill at the time, and my mind was elsewhere. And I finally said to her, half the movies you don't like seem to have had nothing to do with whether or not the story was good or you were good, just because you have personal problems. And you didn't concentrate. She said, well, I suppose you're right. I hadn't thought about that. She said, yes. So I said, it wasn't that they were bad or you didn't like them, you just... And I thought, oh, you're so wonderful. I mean, you see, I mean, of course I would have liked to have had a much more detailed interview. And when I talk about Jerome Kern, it's amazing, perhaps, that you can be a many-faceted human being and always kind and compassionate and good-humored, but you're not, but your levels of interest or your range of interests are going to be quite, she wasn't, so I wasn't acting. So if I could explain her well, I probably could have had a better interview, I could have explained it better. I knew that to get her in there, because I just wanted the sound of Irene Dunn. I just wanted the sound of her voice in the book. I just knew that even if it wasn't a great interview, you'd still hear Irene Dunn for a little bit. And you'd hear that voice. And you'd see those eyes. And you'd just see that turn of her head. I just wanted that. I just wanted that as a moment of gracefulness. And so I knew I had to write an introduction that would set up why this otherwise relatively short interview, in which she doesn't go for much, would still give you a sense of why she's so wonderful. She just doesn't make hay out of a lot of things. She doesn't do a big deal out of a lot of things. And that, after all, is one of her great charms in things. The primary qualities about her is that she's such a good mother. She's such a good, if she plays a mother. She's such a good wife if she plays a good wife. She's such a good mistress if she plays a mistress. She's just a very good, wonderfully talented person. But I didn't think it wasn't what I would have called a great interview, except that this book allowed me to use lesser interviews for the sound of their voice, because other people would make up for it in other ways, Maybe after you've read 24 pages with To Little Banquet, then maybe 7 pages with Irene Dunn seemed quite wonderful,
It's interesting, Hollywood is so full of people that must have had enormous influence, and yet they themselves do never grasp the public for various reasons. For instance, Hermes Pan.
Hermes.
Is that how we pronounce it?
Hermes Pan.
Hermes Pan, yes. Tell me about him.
Well, what do you want to know about Hermes?
Well, he was certainly, was an interesting choreographer, and he was an interesting dancer, and he certainly was very close to Fred Astaire.
Very self-effacing. Very self-effacing.
Do you think that's real, or that he thought it was necessary?
No, it was real. Hermes, that doesn't mean he doesn't have a great sense of pride. It doesn't mean he doesn't have that he doesn't feel anger or bitterness or frustration. It doesn't mean that he knows that some of his flashier things than his will be appreciated more, just like there is a Betty Davis to Hermes Pan's Irene Dunn. And a Betty Davis to Hermes Pan's Irene Dunn would be a Bob Fosse, would have been a Jack Cole, who had a sharp tongue, who could analyze, break down, and build up things all over the place. I mean, you're continuously dazzled by Jack Cole talking, his acerbic wit, his sharp mind, and his very energetic work. Hermes is much more quiet and reflective, and Hermes you think of always as Fred Astaire, which is not unfair, because after all, Fred Astaire is a genius at his craft, and if you are part of working with a genius, even if people may not always know how important your contribution was, you know if you work with something rather remarkable. If other people can't separate it, it doesn't take away from the fact that you've had an extraordinary experience. But it did mean forever afterwards that people always saw that's Hermes Pan who worked with a stair, so therefore his work is good because he worked with a stair. But actually his work would have been good if he had never worked with a stair. He was still going to be better than Sammy Lee. He was still going to be better than Busby Berkeley or Bobby Connolly. There was no question of that. But once you've worked with a giant, like if you work with Garbo, people are always going to talk to George Cukor first about Garbo and then maybe Hepburn and then other things. That's just the way it's going to work. It's simple. It's such a powerful image already set up for you. Hermes is also, he would have been a monk at one point if he'd had an alternate choice. Hermes is very self-effacing, but he's got a sense of humor. And once he feels safe, he tells you quite funny stories, but you have to drag it out of Hermes. You have to know what to push because he's not used to talking. So therefore it doesn't come easily to him because it isn't innate in him. Whereas in Cole is very, Cole, next to Cole, I'm just a little sand, little bubble of sand, which is going to go sweep away. I mean, I'm pretty energetic, but next to Cole, I mean, his energy was commensurate to his intelligence, to his fury, to his...
You had great respect for him?
Well, Jack was also a certain kind of man. I had great respect for him, sure. I mean, that kind of intelligence, that kind of wit. I mean, listen, if you had really taped Jack Cole properly when he was on a harangue, you could have written one of the great, funny, scathing books about ballet, about modern dance, about Hollywood, about moguls, about those kind of men who sponsor ballet companies because they fancy the men in them, and they sit there and the funny things that go wrong. I mean, to listen to Jack Cole talk about Mata Hari, this musical that Vincent Minnelli, oh my God, Jack, I mean, his mouth would turn into a razor, a very fine razor, and he was now just going to make ribbons out of everything. And you thought, thank God, I'm not on that stage. But when he told you about Marisa Mell, who, like so many of these girls coming from Europe, is everything to everybody. So Irene Sharaff had the hots for her, and Marisa's own girlfriend, who also handles Florinda Balkan, had the hots for her. Plus Marisa was screwing some producer who had the hots for her, and there was poor Marisa trying to juggle all those things, plus trying to make sense out of Vincent Minnelli's inarticulate instructions, and having to do some choreography, even though she moved like an elephant in its sleep. I mean, poor Marisa, sometimes, he said, would come on. I mean, she was dead. She was asleep before she walked halfway onto the set because she'd been humped all night long by the producer. She had her girlfriend all over her. There was Irene Sharaff doing these incredible clothes, which I said, but Irene, it's funny, it's coming back to me. Because if you're in the right frame of mind, you can remember how somebody talked. And Irene would do clothes, and I said, Irene, if she, I don't know the terms for it, but if she does this with her hand, it won't work. Irene says, this is my clothes, this is the way it stays. And I said, well, okay, dear, Marisa, do this. Marisa did that. All the dresses split wide open. So, obviously, Irene and he were not close friends. Irene didn't have to redo the clothes, because otherwise we couldn't do the number. The set was on a revolving wheel. It was something very, very new. It was the classic case from Bandwagon, which Minnelli should have known, because he directed Bandwagon, when in one scene set up in the Alps, where Mata Hari comes out on the balcony, and the other guy, the man she's going to fall in love with, comes out of the balcony of his chalet, i.e. the sets move together and the two halves of a house become one chalet. The thing had never been properly fixed, so the set wobbled. His half of the chalet would go up, her half of the chalet would go down. Both were holding onto the rail in terror of their life because the set also kept partying in the middle, so they were moving up and down and partying. It was just everything you can imagine went wrong. It was just your classic, and you could have known it in advance. Vincent wasn't used to theater, he'd been gone for so long. Also, he's very inarticulate. There were all these pressures on poor Maurice, and it was a perfectly nice girl. You see, to Cole, when he talked, there was no censoriousness about your private life. Meaning that if too much private life goes on when you're working, it's going to screw things up, even if you were just being humped by 5 guys, or if you were just being humped by one husband, or if you and your one husband were simply not humping. I mean, I don't care what you did, but he was just giving you all the component parts, so that suddenly you saw this producer who was glowering at Irene Sharaff, who felt that everybody else was undermining her designs and wanted to get her own hands on Marisa, and poor Marisa, who thought this was a big chance on Broadway, and it was in a sense. Mata Hari, Marisa Mell, Minnelli, all the ingredients were potent death. Just one of those classic death things. And nobody's ever written it up. Now, if you had taped Cole at great length, believe me, people today would still be talking about this corrosively funny, scathing, send-up of all the pretensions, including his own. He was perfectly aware that sometimes he would go off on a tangent and come up with a lot of folderol and fiddle-dee. And he said, when you get into these binds, you get caught in a trap. You suddenly go along with everything, and then it's too late, and you're tearing your hair, and you're wondering, what am I doing this for a living? I don't need this. I'd rather give me 6 good dances, and I'll just work their ass off, and we'll do things in nightclubs and have a great time. That was Cole. Well, Hermes Pan isn't like that. Not at all. I'm going to have to phone London. Okay? Yes? I'm not going to be long to London, but I've just got to tell him about this call.
No. You've been very generous, John, with your time and we've done this on 2 coasts. I have fed you both times.
Yes.
And as always, I find it totally stimulating and totally invigorating. You talk about energy. I mean, you add so much to everything that you say with your own physical involvement in it.
Only it's not articulate, is it?
Well, it's more articulate than you're willing to accept. I think that what happens is that as you get off into a philosophical whirlwind of thoughts, your mind races ahead so rapidly that you begin to suspect that perhaps you're not communicating.
Yeah.
But you are indeed, and this is very valuable material, and I'm delighted to have it.
Oh.
So bless you, and on behalf of the Fashion Institute of Technology, thank you very, very much.
Robert, I'm chuffed. But it's true, I don't always, this is the problem. I'm not as in control of what I'm thinking till I start to think it, and then you don't know where it's going to end up sometimes. And all you're trying to say is, well, what are you trying to say? I'm trying to say that these are great works of art, and they're worth it if I sell it to you for $900. And the photographer deserves his $900. But if you're stupid enough to pay $900 for any piece of paper, then at least these pieces of paper will make your stupidity at least a bit more enchanted. Because really, in the end, if you're so crazy about photographs, get an old magazine, copy it, and you've got a picture on the wall. You know, if you're going to be impressed by a signature, if you're going to be impressed by stupid words like vintage, if you're going to be impressed by saying, you know, by all those things that don't make sense about different kinds of paper, then what are you impressed about at all? I mean, it's the image that counts, and the images that these people created, especially in that period, 29. Isn't that funny? The timing was extraordinary. It starts in 29, finishes by 37, 38. Because what happens after that is a whole new, different kind of thing. More buoyant, a kind of America, different kind of America, and then the war, and then we simply went into total mindlessness. It was all technicolored. Everybody looked like they were blown up by one of those pumps you use for bicycle tires. It wasn't that they looked pneumatic, but their cheeks looked pneumatic, their hair looked pneumatic. Everything about them was, you know, there's something worth fighting for. Apple pie for the world. We'll give you apple pie. And all of America went to war in Europe so that all those people in gas chambers could have apple pie as they went. I mean, and you get a different kind of imagery, which is quite interesting in its own right. I'm beginning to realize more and more, but it doesn't belong to this great, really profound body of work that really told you about a country and what it was capable of and actually did achieve. And these people are great symbols of America, of the American spirit. These are as extraordinary as I think your Abe Lincolns and your Mark Twains. People who you're proud of, not because they were noble men or decent men or great writers, because the quality of their writing and the quality of their nobility had to do with why you were in America and not living like shtetl in Poland. You know, it was the American spirit. And I think when I look at Jimmy Stewart, maybe not so much Jimmy Stewart, but look at these people, whether it's Dietrich, who becomes not a German star, but an American star who speaks with a German accent, and Garbo is not a Swedish star, she's an American star who speaks with the mystery of Olaf Strindberg and who's that famous Scandinavian writer, you know, Ibsen. That's what she is. Suddenly Ibsen becomes comprehensible because Garbo is all these Ibsen women. Ibsen created the modern woman in the theater. Now she comes and sweeps the world in the presence of one woman who plays romantic folderol. The folderol is simply the trapping, is simply you have to walk down a street. You don't always pick Fifth Avenue. Sometimes you walk along, in the Bowery, but by God, this is a new force, a new face that hadn't existed before. And that face, so Garbo is an American star who represents a new era in liberation, in women's acceptance of themselves. And these photographs show you that. They show you that these were incredibly potent symbolic forces, and most of them had it in them to be that for a long time. They were unique to finally age and fame and everything else pulls you down a bit. But that's inevitable. That's inevitable. I mean, remember, speaking about age earlier, Dietrich, in her 50s, created a whole new life with all, you remember we were talking about earlier, but you have to be young? Well, Dietrich wasn't young when she started the last phase of her career, which was her personal phase, and her most, and not her most glorious, because I think when she worked with Sternberg, she was to Sternberg what Hermes Pam was to Fred Astaire. The only thing is that unlike Hermes Pan, who was in the shadow of the genius in Dietrich's case was in the shadow of the creation, but then we're always going to be more responsive to women than we will be, but it's that kind of thing. But in the 50s, when Dietrich was on her uppers, what was she going to do? There aren't going to be that many roles, no matter how good you look for your age, there are going to be fewer and fewer and fewer parts. She creates a whole, using everything she had learned, because she still had energy, she still had guts, and becomes really the first, at least the first in my lifetime, and I think the first when she did it in so long that nobody remembered the Sarah Bernhardts and the people who did the vaudeville circuit, who virtually becomes a one-woman vaudeville show, the whole vaudeville era. She tours around the world, makes a game out of glamour, creates an aura of illusion and energy and humor and drama and everything, all by how she's lit and how she stands and how she places her voice in the middle of the lighting and all those things. And becomes your genuine star. So genuine that perhaps if no longer the millions who would pay tickets at the box office were gone, still many, many, many more thousands than will go to see on Broadway. She was a megastar. Pardon me, and she was that till her mid-60s. So she still had it. People do. Bette Davis had it, has it. Not everybody. It's rarer, but when it happens, it's as rare when it happens in your old age as it ever was when you were young too, because there are billions of young people every year, and not every one of them makes it to Hollywood, and not every one of them arises as Carole Lombard or Robert Taylor or Barbara Stanwyck or Loretta Young or any of them. If you say Loretta Young, but she's so pretty. Oh God, pretty, pretty, pretty. Of course she is, but she's not the only one. Her prettiness was, however it was, she maneuvered her way to get there. Then how, when she got there, she moved in this incredibly solid, strong line and just kept going and going and going. You have to, this isn't done because you're pretty and you wear nice clothes. It means you've got enormous will and strength and determination and character, and it's those qualities we like about it, don't you think?
I think so. It's what we like about you.
Oh,
Thank you
Robert.
again, John.
Thank you
very much.